You're not going to learn hyperdimensional physics down here. Almost tiny food have clean energy technologies, flying craft and cars, and a clean environment. This technology can help our economy by creating more jobs. Oil companies can invest in systems that use and relate this new clean energy technology. With climate change, the environment getting even more polluted, animal species dying off every day, fluoride in our food and water that was recently discovered to cause brain damage, cancers caused from pesticides, glyphosate forever chemicals, plastic in our oceans, plastic in our bloodstreams disrupting endocrine glands. How much longer can we afford to wait? For the animals, our trees, the environment, the future of human civilization. Will we continue on a path of greed, self-destruction, nihilism, apathy, mental sickness, and ignorance, or will logic and reason break the cycle?
To give you an example, if you put a bowling ball in the middle of your bed, and 2 feet away you take your fist and you push it down, the bowling ball rolls towards it. And that's exactly how the craft operates. It focuses the single emitter and creates a gravity distortion, essentially a divot in space-time.
You're riding a wave, basically. You create a wave, and you're on top of the tsunami wave, and you're riding across space-time.
Hi, I'm Luigi Vendatelli.
And I'm Bob Lazar.
And we're in Montreal on the set of Project Gravator. 2 days ago was a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C., which is making news around the world. And if you had one comment to say, Bob, on this congressional hearing, what would it be?
I told you so.
So you get on the plane in Las Vegas, Janet plane,
Yeah, right.
fly up there, they put you on a bus with the blacked out windows.
Oh yeah, when we were going S4, right. Yeah.
Yes. So you land at Groom Lake,
Land at 51 and then,
you sign some papers.
yeah, if you want to make it a short version, yeah, right.
You had told me the story that they started showing these briefing books that sort of laid out the general story. Was that at Groom or was that?
That was at S4.
That was at
no,
S4.
that material would never get north of
People
S4.
work at Groom Lake who say, I never heard any of this stuff. I
Of
never
course.
saw any flying saucers.
There is no flying saucer stuff at 51. No, that's, look, 51 is, there's lots of people working there. It'd be hard. When I worked at S4, again, I have no idea how it is today, but, you know, back in my day at S4, there were 22 people that had clearance and knowledge of the ET material, ET crafts. That was it. We were given the list. We knew the names on the list. That was it. I still know the names on that list today. And those are some of the things that I never say anything to you about because...
Yeah, why is that?
Well, exactly. There has to be some stuff I keep to myself because you know how many times people said, yeah, hey, I worked out there with Bob and so on and so forth. Really? Who are you? What'd you do? And whatever. And it's only the stuff I said. I'm waiting for the guy that says, hey, yeah, I worked out with you and here's some of the other people on the list. Or we did this, or is that, so it's, if I don't keep that stuff, there's nothing I have to verify if some other guy comes up to me.
You see it all the time, though, don't you? I imagine you get emails all the time, or you read stories, or you hear claims on, if you watched television, you'd hear it, that is, about people who claim they've been out there, and obviously they're making it up.
Well, I mean, the most recent was this...
Bushman?
I think it was like, yeah, like the CIA guy or something like that. Was it?
There was an anonymous guy who had a...
He was dying or he died? Yeah, and a lot of people asked me, hey, do you know? And he was apparently very supportive of me, and but I never heard of him. And what am I going to say? I've never heard of the guy and never seen him.
You had seen these posters you described that were on the walls.
Yeah, the They're Here posters.
Describe what the posters
Yeah, they went through the trouble of actually making a picture of the sport model that was lifting, obviously off of Papoose Lake, because you can see the background there, and it just said, They're Here. And it was like a commercial poster. I mean, they looked like they were lithographed. I mean, they must have been printed on site. They wouldn't have done that out there. But
Obviously somebody's idea of a joke.
Yeah, it was good to see that level of, I don't know, lightheartedness out there.
First day you get a look at the sport model, what are you thinking to yourself? Oh my God, what are you thinking?
No, it was alien flying saucer did not enter my mind.
It was ours.
Yeah, it was exactly the opposite that, well, this explains all the UFO sightings, that, we have some field propulsion technology. It has to be in this, shape or form, flying saucer type, and this is what people have been seeing for a long time, thinking that they're alien craft, and it made perfect sense to me. It's like, great, I'd really like to be part of this project, advanced propulsion. This is dynamite. So I was excited to be part of it. In fact, when we went by it, and I think I'd even mentioned to you, it had a little American flag stuck on it, and I dragged my hand across it, and, it felt like cold, so I just assumed it was metal and got yelled at immediately, don't keep your hands at your side, walk forward. All right. And so I went in, I was introduced to my working partner, who was Barry Castillo, or whatever I pronounce his last name. And the way they worked there was everything was very compartmentalized, so everybody had a buddy to work with. And that is the only person you can talk and converse with and bounce ideas off of. You can't talk to anybody else in any other group. You can't, even if we go sit and there's a bunch of other people around, you can only talk to the guy, your buddy, they called him. So anyway, so he was my buddy, and the first day we went in there, he was excited to show me everything, and it seemed like he had been alone for too long. And he was really excited that I was there, and I was kind of picking up on his enthusiasm, going, well, he says, boy, you are gonna just die when you see this, and one of the first things he did was, fire up one of the reactor that had been taken out of the crash. There's very little about this. Essentially, for size comparison, half a basketball on a plate. That was probably
not a whole lot of moving parts, nothing really.
No, nothing. I mean, it's just incredibly simple. There was nothing there that could do anything and it was too small to hold any large power source or anything.
So what did he show you?
Anyway, the top came off, and he put the top on, and then he said, "Go ahead and grab the sphere." And as my hands approached it, I couldn't touch it, which was fantastic. And if you ever played with magnets, I'm sure everybody has. You take two like poles of a magnet and you can kind of feel that balance. It was exactly like that, but it was my hands. They weren't magnetic. And he says, you're feeling an artificially produced gravitational field. And that really floored me. And, I began to run through in my mind, how can this be a joke or faked, or there's no way. And that's the first time that it was kind of a domino effect than what I had read in the briefings and going, these guys aren't kidding. This is unbelievable.
Let's go. In the briefing books, you see the craft described, and then you get into some more exotic stuff that you had to wonder, are they messing with your head? Alien stuff.
Yeah, there was. It was a one and only briefing, whatever you want to call it. Or an overview of it was split. The entire program there was split into individual projects, and each had an overview of each project, and each group got an overview of all the other projects in case there was some connection to what they were doing. But it was clear they didn't want everybody to know everything. And although the military loves doing that, it really screws up trying to move forward and
too compartmentalized. You can't.
It's insane, but they really enjoy that. But anyway, the only thing that dealt with any kind of biological
entities.
It's essentially what you'd call them. There was just a view of a creature, and the closest estimation I can give you is a gray, because it had a head with the large eyes, but what they were focusing on was a T-cut in the chest, and it was one large organ, and the comments were about how it functioned as a liver, a lungs, a heart, as if all organs had grown together or evolved together, where it was just, an all-purpose
internal organ.
Yeah, I guess. I don't really have an analogy for it.
The sport model, no dents, no scrapes.
No, it looked like it came right out of the showroom.
And it looked like the Billy Meyer beam ship.
Yeah, from the pictures I've seen of the Billy Meyer one, which, it looked fake to me, but no, there it is.
I'm sure the Billy Meyer people are happy about that, but I mean, you know, there's a lot of people don't take that case seriously, and
it's either the most amazing coincidence on the face of the earth, or something really did happen to that guy, Billy Meyer. Barry and I were in the lab. We were working. Dennis came in and he said, "There's a test flight going on. Bob, why don't you come out here? Barry, you can tag along too." And that's when we came in, you know, side door into the hangar. The craft was already out onto the dry lake bed in front of, or the lake bed proper, but it was out in front of the door. And probably about 2 minutes after I got there, the craft just began to silently lift off the ground, and there was a guy between where I was standing and the door that had a small desk, and there was some sort of transmitter on it, and he was just on a microphone talking apparently to somebody in the craft. And at the time, that again immediately set up a red flag in my mind going, that's not supposed to work either. There is a craft being powered and surrounded by an intense gravitational field. How are the radio waves getting into this thing? It just didn't make sense. But again, very few things did there, and I didn't have much of an opportunity to connect all the dots. But it lifted off the ground silently. There was an obvious high voltage corona discharge. It was beginning to get a little late, but you could see the purple-blue glow. But as soon as it lifted off, you know, 6-10 feet, that dissipated, and it just moved around and sat back down where it was. But it doesn't sound like much, but it was incredibly impressive. There wasn't a sound other than a little hiss when it first took off. But you know, it's a big device. It moved around and sat down, and I mean, I was beaming. It was so cool.
We live in a vast sea of energy. Everything, every atom, every subatomic particle is in constant motion, spinning eternally. Even in the cold, dark, absolute vacuum of empty space, there exists what new physics is calling the quantum vacuum flux. It is the ether of the ancients, the life force energy of metaphysics, are the random fluctuations of this vast field of potential in which space and time are embedded. Now, theoretically and mathematically proven, the question no longer is, does this zero-point energy exist? But rather, can we tap this inexhaustible resource of free and unlimited energy and manifest new technologies which are both inexpensive and environmentally safe? One thing is certain. If we continue on the course of rapidly burning fossil fuels and relying on nuclear fission, the future of our civilization is in grave jeopardy. We're at a critical juncture where the ravages of industrial pollution and radioactive waste have exceeded the carrying capacity of Mother Earth. Our finite reserves of oil and gas will be completely exhausted by the year 2025 at the present rate of consumption. Large corporate and governmental self-interest ignore this pending crisis and resist change to the status quo. The question must be asked, is this the kind of world we want to pass down to future generations? Emerging on the frontiers of science, a pioneering breed of theoretical physicists and inspired inventors are challenging the way we think about harnessing the unseen forces of nature. Despite ridicule, lack of funding, and outright suppression, they are confronting an outmoded classical worldview and ushering in a monumental scientific revolution. In this program, you will witness the groundbreaking work of tireless inventors and visionary scientists who may hold the keys to true energy independence for every person on Earth, from Nikola Tesla to the reality of cold fusion and beyond. Join us as we present Free Energy, the race to zero point.
Most people would agree you can't get something for nothing. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And yet, we get our oxygen free from the air we breathe. We get sunlight free, and water, that used to be free until bottled drinking water came along. But what about energy? We've always had to pay for that, whether it's wood or coal, oil or electricity. It's always been the rule that you can never get back more energy than what you put in the first place. That's a fundamental law of nature. Physicists of the 19th century figured that out with the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of energy. Maybe so. But science has come a long way since then. And laws? Well, there's never been one that hasn't been broken.
At the turn of the last century, Nikola Tesla, the great inventor who gave us alternating current and the Tesla coil, stated,
"Electric power is everywhere present in unlimited quantities. I can drive the world's machinery without the need of coal, oil, gas, or any other fuel. This new power for the driving of the world's machinery will be derived from the energy which operates the universe, the cosmic energy."
With over 200 patents to his name, Tesla was well on his way to transmitting electric power without wires when he ran into trouble with J.P. Morgan and the financial interest of 1901. His ambitious Wardenclyffe project to magnify and transmit power to ships at sea and eventually to provide free electricity for the whole world was scuttled by Morgan, leaving Tesla penniless and disillusioned. The wealthy industrialist of the time knew that their vast plans to wire the world with copper from the mines they owned would be upset if they could no longer control the supply and means of delivery. Tesla's beliefs about developing technology in harmony with nature conflicted with the prevailing American attitude at the time that mankind was put on Earth to subdue and dominate nature. Little by little, Tesla was denounced as a crackpot and deleted from the historical record. At the time of his death in 1943, Tesla's truckloads of scientific papers were seized by U.S. government agencies. Who knows what ideas and remarkable devices our world could have inherited if only his genius was recognized.
When J.P. Morgan prohibited Tesla from broadcasting electric power overseas with Wardenclyffe Tower, he said, "I can't put a meter on it, therefore I won't finance it." That literally changed the course of history, and for the past almost 100 years, we've been suffering under that profit motive.
Of course, one could say that mankind was hardly ready to handle the awesome forces Tesla had glimpsed. The 20th century would bring world wars and technological innovations far more horrific than had ever been witnessed by Western civilization. Even before Tesla, the groundwork that would lead to free energy had been pioneered by great scientists like Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell. In 1831, Faraday modeled his rotating magnet and disk generator after the Earth, whose rotation around a molten metal core keeps the planet spinning in a self-sustaining magnetic field. His work later resulted in the development of the dynamo. Also called a homopolar or unipolar generator, the Faraday generator provides the basis for much of what is being done today in the electromagnetic approach to free energy, such as with Bruce De Palma's In Machine and Paramahamsa Tiwari's space-powered generator. Repeated experiments have detected anomalous electrical outputs greater than that used to rotate the disk. The friction and voltage limitations have hampered efficiency and therefore widespread acceptance. James Clerk Maxwell, best known for his Maxwell's equations, is reputed to have set things straight with his theories of electrical properties in a way that eliminates zero-point energy. But Maxwell's more advanced work allowed for the existence of an ether, a substance finer than air, which since the time of Plato had been considered a scientific fact.
The prevailing belief of the time was that the vacuum was a thin material fluid, the so-called material ether, which we know today is false. The ether is there, but it's not the observable material fluid. Faraday had re-established this notion of lines of force, but he thought the electromagnetic field, or the electromagnetic disturbances in the ether, so to speak, was really twanging strings. The strings were under tension, and when you had a disturbance, what you really did was pluck the strings. Now, Maxwell states very clearly that he set about to actually capture exactly what Faraday was doing in his lines of force in the theory, and that's what he did. Maxwell's actual theory is 20 equations and 20 unknowns in quaternions, which is a higher topology algebra. You can do things in that you can't dream of in doing in tensors, and you certainly can't do in vectors, and you certainly can't do with the theory that's taught at our universities. All that remains to be rediscovered and uncovered.
The now famous Michelson-Morley experiment at the turn of the century failed to detect a stationary ether, so classical physics presumed once and for all that it did not exist. The case was closed until quantum mechanics reopened the discussion, allowing for a new interpretation of how matter interacts with a zero-point field.
Most of our scientific community actually believes that empty space, the nature of space itself, is completely empty, devoid of anything. And historically, it's very interesting because in the 1800s, and even earlier, they believed there was an ether, an all-pervading substance filling up space. And in 1905, when relativity theory became very popular, they said, well, we don't need this ether. Empty space is empty. Then 25 years or 20 years later, in 1925, when quantum mechanics comes into play, all of a sudden, a new energy appears in equations of quantum mechanics, and it has to be there to make the equations work, and it has to do with fluctuations of electromagnetic field energy at a very high frequency that interacts with everything. And they called this the zero-point energy, and it turns out that all the elementary particles interact with this energy, and it becomes a potential energy source. That's what we're discovering today.
Well, free energy is basically, and another word for it is zero-point energy. It's energy that is contained within the vacuum of space, and which is virtually undetectable by any traditional means. In fact, the energy is homogeneous and isotropic. The same everywhere, the same in all directions. And because of that, it's trying to extract it or measure it is sort of like the problem of trying to weigh a beaker of water underneath the surface of the ocean. What do you measure with respect to what? And that's been the physicist's dilemma, and we've gone down one very large cul-de-sac this century. The cul-de-sac meaning that there is no such thing as consciousness. There is no such thing as this zero-point field, or this place from which the energy can come. And the answer now appears to be yes, because theoretical physics and a number of experiments in quantum mechanics show very clearly the existence of this all-pervasive electromagnetic field called the zero-point field.
In fact, although skeptics often point to Einstein's theory of relativity, it was Einstein who in 1920 said,
"There are weighty arguments to be adduced in favor of the ether hypothesis. To deny the ether is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical qualities whatsoever. The fundamental facts of mechanics do not harmonize with this view. According to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable."
The term vacuum has been used in several totally different senses. Some engineers use it to mean you just pump out all the air and that's called a vacuum, and that's vacuum technology. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about empty space-time. We know today, for example, the Lamb shift in quantum mechanics showed that this exchange of energy between the vacuum and the charged particles is in fact real and generates real effects. And you can measure it, and he was given the Nobel Prize, Lamb was, for doing that kind of measurement and showing it in the physics literature. So we know it's real. Experimentally it's detected. The Casimir shift, for example, shows clearly that it's there, and it does generate energetic effects in your actual materials. It turns out that in the modern view, the modern quantum mechanical view, if you apply that knowledge that's been gained there, what you find is that the vacuum is fiercely active. It's a fierce energy flux and going in all directions at all times. The energy density of that, as estimated by various physicists, is extremely high. For example, in 1 cubic centimeter, if you could take the raw energy in that cubic centimeter and condense it into mass, divided by c squared, you would have more observable mass result from that than our largest telescope can see in the observable universe and all the stars and planets today. And so the energy that's there is extremely dense and extremely fierce. This drives everything that we call physical reality, from the quantum level right on up to the observed level and the observed world that we live in. Everything is energetically driven by the vacuum.
The Sea of Energy in Which the Earth Floats was a revolutionary book written by T. Henry Moray, an electrical engineer and Tesla enthusiast who in the early 20s began working on a device he claimed intercepted radiant energy from outer space. His solid-state detector, the Moray valve, was designed with a complex series of semiconductors, high-voltage capacitors, and transformers hooked up to an antenna and a ground wire. By stimulating the existing oscillations of space energy, his radiant energy device ran for days, putting out 50 kilowatts of electricity. His public demonstrations attracted newspaper coverage and scientists from Bell Laboratories and the Department of Agriculture's Rural Electrification Administration. Although no one could find evidence of fraud, neither could anyone explain how the radiant energy device worked. During the 30s, he developed semiconductors and transistors that were far ahead of their time. Unfortunately, as all too many inventors have suffered, when he refused to sell out to powerful interests, Moray and his family were threatened, shot at, and their laboratory ransacked. Ignored by the U.S. Patent Office, Moray quietly stopped public disclosure of the device after it was destroyed by his assistant, Felix Frazier, a communist sympathizer who was frustrated when Moray declined his repeated offers to take that technology to Russia. Today, Moray's sons, John and Richard, continue to pursue their father's dream. In Europe, Victor Schauberger's vortex experiments during the 1930s resulted in an advanced understanding of how the spiraling motions inherent in all natural systems reverse the effects of entropy. By studying the properties of inwardly spiraling water, he created an implosion generator that concentrated electrical charge.
Victor Schauberger is one of my heroes who talked about a possible science based on the inward motion rather than the let's explode everything, break it up and study the atom by breaking it up into little pieces. Let's study the atom by looking at how it wants to move naturally in a spiraling motion. And the same with everywhere you look in nature.
Schauberger's ideas became widely known before World War II when he was coerced to work for the Nazis on exotic discs that resembled flying saucers, as well as his energy generator. In 1958, he traveled to the United States, where he was told he could manufacture his devices. But he was duped into signing over all of his rights, and none of his inventions were ever developed. Returning to Austria, he died a bitter and broken man. Visionary philosopher, artist, and scientist Walter Russell's contributions to the understanding of energy are significant, even though ignored by mainstream academia. Russell's revised periodical table of the elements, based on a spiral, predicted many unknown elements and isotopes like plutonium and deuterium. His cosmological theories about the mystical nature of reality challenged physicists to think in terms of energy, light, and matter as one substance.
There's electricity in the air. It's a common expression and one that's true. Take a comb, run it through your hair on a dry day, and you can get a static shock. Sure, it's electricity, all right, but could it also be tapped to produce sufficient energy we could all use?
Benjamin Franklin is credited as being the inventor of the electrostatic motor back in the 1700s, but its power output was modest. The Wimshurst electrostatic generator is a high-voltage mechanism developed in the 1800s, which can be hand or self-started and will produce dramatic sparking while charging Leyden jars. Today, it's used in teaching about electricity, but its practical applications are considered inconsequential. A high-tech variation of the Wimshurst device is the Testatica, or Swiss ML converter. Developed by Paul Baumann of the Maternita community in Switzerland during the 70s, this free energy device is a marvel that has been in operation for more than 20 years, supplying electricity to the small, self-sufficient Christian community. Many technical experts have come away stumped by its excess output. However, because the community feels that the majority of mankind is not ready to be responsible for such unlimited energy, they're keeping the technology under wraps until such time the world is spiritually prepared. Other researchers, like Dr. Oleg Jefamenko, continue to pursue real-world applications for harnessing the electrostatic motor.
His accomplishment, I feel, is the best, is that he used a specific type of electret, which is a waxy substance which holds charge, and it's like in many ways a magnet, electrical analog of a magnet. And he's achieved a 0.1 horsepower motor, which is a small device. So, and this runs continually on atmospheric electricity.
Like the homopolar generator, the electrostatic motor is based on the dynamics of our Earth environment. As with wind and solar power, they offer real, sustainable alternatives that, with only modest gains in efficiency, could contribute to the replacement of our current dependence on fossil fuels. Are we clever enough to learn from the clues our planet is providing? Upon the foundation of innovative thinkers and inventors like Tesla and Morey, the modern age of free energy research began. In the 1950s, as waves of flying saucer sightings occurred throughout the United States, and while an infant space program was trying to catch up with the Russians' launch of Sputnik, a man named T. Townsend Brown was busy on experiments that defied conventional understanding about electricity, gravitation, and propulsion. Along with Drs. Paul Byfield and Agnew Bonson, Brown took high voltage to the next extreme. In this rare home movie, the earliest experiments in electrogravitics are recorded. By using high voltages over 20,000 and up to 200,000 volts, Brown discovered that highly charged capacitors would exhibit a noticeable thrust in one direction. Although awarded a patent for his electrokinetic generator, no one has ever reproduced his experiment until recently. Larry Davenport, shown here demonstrating his replication of Brown's electrokinetic apparatus, explains.
But when I first began to read Brown's stuff, I didn't quite understand the difference between the ion wind devices, which there's a lot of them out there, and some of them are very efficient as far as producing ion wind, and his particular apparatus. I finally decided to do Brown's work and
1994, I looked at his device. I'd tried several different things and they hadn't worked, and I thought, well, Brown is supposed to be the pioneer of this, or so the people that make the claims and that get the patents, they always refer to his name. So I thought, I'll go back and I'll try to do this. Getting it balanced was real important.
His method of propulsion specifically was using the charge separation, high voltage charge separation on a vehicle. He found that circular craft were better for that application than winged craft. However, recently we found through Dr. Paul LaViolette's research that the B-2 bomber actually seems to qualify as an electrogravitic craft. The military has admitted that it electrically charges the forward leading edge of the wings. There's also a very high dielectric being used. Depleted uranium is used on the forward edge of the wings. And whether or not there are other applications for that technology and that design, we're recognizing that because the exhaust gas is also negatively ionized, that all of a sudden we have the high voltage charge separation that's necessary to provide an extra propulsive force, especially at high velocities. So electrogravity in that aspect is a very simple process, but does provide a good amount of force for a very small amount of energy input.
As with many other promising inventions developed during the Cold War years, the National Secrecy Act prevented scientists like T. Townsend Brown from commercializing or even publicizing any technology which could potentially be interpreted as having a military application. The triumph of America's space exploration program gave way to the era of limits in the late 70s. The infamous energy crisis made us all aware of our dependence on finite resources.
Many inventors promised dramatic results with devices they said would solve the crisis. Claims of over-unity, where power output exceeds input, were routinely announced. But when put to the test, most of their crude prototypes performed poorly, or not at all. Measuring methods were, and still are, extremely difficult to perform accurately. The few that did achieve modest gains in output were dismissed by mainstream academia and denied patents. And without patent protection, investors have no financial incentive to lay out the millions of dollars it takes to mass produce and market these devices, no matter how promising the technology. And after all, classical Newtonian dynamics got us to the moon, and Einstein's E equal mc squared explained that energy could neither be created nor destroyed. Anything else, which seemed otherwise, was labeled perpetual motion, unworthy of scientific examination.
When I started out in 1980, free energy was something that we didn't talk about. We talked about it behind closed doors. The conferences often were visited by people we didn't know, and the information was spread in various means so that all of a sudden non-conventional energy, which was a phrase we developed, was appearing in military solicitations. So it's a controversial topic that at that time actually had the connotation that there was something from nothing. Therefore, it was unscientific, and these are a bunch of lunatics who are talking, and sooner or later the scientists will educate them about what's the various laws of physics that are being violated.
Well, most of the scientists equated any notion of a free energy or over-unity device as being a perpetual motion machine, and therefore utter nonsense. You see, it's a play on words. The scientists interpreted it one way, the guys trying to do it are looking at it as an open system. Now, fortunately today, we have a type of thermodynamics. Nobel Prizes have been issued for it, to Prigogine, for example, for systems not in thermodynamic equilibrium that do have. They're open systems, and the energy does flow in from outside and through them. Those kinds of systems can produce over-unity. It's all perfectly legitimate physics.
Today, most scientists are unaware of the literature that the zero-point energy even exists, mainly because most scientists aren't physicists. Now, I went to school and I became getting a PhD in electrical engineering and systems engineering, and not one professor ever heard of it. And yet there it was in the library. So part of it is most scientists are specialists in their own area, and science today is very fragmented. Now, for those that know that the zero-point energy exists, they may argue, well, it's random in its nature, and therefore it can't be tapped as an energy source. But very recent work in thermodynamics by Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize in 1978, shows how this energy could become self-organized if the proper systems conditions could be fulfilled. And that's what's happening in some of the experiments, in some of the inventions that are tapping this energy and producing anomalous energy. Another resistance is the physics community, especially, that really know about this energy, realize if you could tap it, everything would change. The nature of physics would change. The most important foundation of all physics would then be the quantum energy that's embedded in space. And really, we don't understand it. And it's extremely mathematically difficult to do computations in it. And it turns out it's probably going to be the basis of string theory in the future.
And therefore, what seems to be nothing will actually be understood as a field effect, as a tapping of energy that is already available but can't be seen. Even the radio waves, for example, the television set is a good example. If you show that to a primitive tribe, it looks like a magical box. But it's literally converting invisible energy in the air to signals and pictures.
The paddle wheel in the river that's used to power a mill, grind corn, is a free energy device. So is a windmill, for example. What we mean is we are taking the energy from an external source and using it. So it's an open system, and the environment of the system is furnishing a flow of energy into the system, which the system is then collecting and using. Primary requirements: it has to be an open system, it has to have an external source of energy to furnish the energy that we're going to use, and therefore it's no more mysterious than a windmill.
And now we're coming full circle and realizing that physics and metaphysics, that some of the notions of the 19th century, such as the ether and the vortex, are now being dusted off, and those ideas are being melded with modern experiments, plus quantum mechanics and so forth, into this magnificent synthesis of what I call sacred science, of a whole new science, a whole new physics in which consciousness reigns supreme, and where we don't have to follow any particular guru or a leader or anything like that, that we have everything we need in the universe. It's ours to have right now. And these are some of the basic essence principles that lie underneath the discovery of free energy.
The force of inertia is known in mechanics, but until only recently, it had been considered too weak and difficult to harness for propulsion. According to some theorists, like Hal Puthoff, inertia, like gravity, is what occurs when we try to accelerate an object against the zero-point fluctuations in the vacuum. We run into resistance, literally. Canadian inventor Roy Thornton has developed an inertial impulse propulsion engine which overcomes that resistance using centrifugal force. It pushes against nothing and emits no exhaust, but it's been calculated to be 20 times more efficient than a jet engine. Here, the Thornton inertial propulsion drive powers a canoe in a swimming pool. The motor, which is housed in a box, never contacts the water or air. In the pendulum test, unidirectional force is being generated to keep the pendulum to one side.
Whether or not we can demonstrate, as I have, with engineering analysis and models that will climb an incline, will pass a pendulum test, in other words, stay on one side of the pendulum consistently, and even power a canoe in a swimming pool, commercialization of that device is still a very difficult road. And we see that in many inventions, but what I like to emphasize is my F over P measurement of that is literally 20 times better than the jet engine. A jet engine, typically a commercial jet engine, the DC-9, I think is the one that I analyzed, has about 0.016 newtons per watt. And then this is in the metric system. Now, when we look at the Thornton, he's able to achieve 0.32 newtons per watt, literally 20 times better than the jet engine.
Roy Thornton is developing refinements to his system to increase its performance. Unfortunately, like many inventors, even with a U.S. patent in hand, he is yet to find sufficient investment capital to bring his motor to the marketplace.
Propulsion force does in fact exist.
We've all seen these little toy gizmos that demonstrate lightning in a bottle. It's the electric phenomenon called plasma discharge. Various inventors, working independently, are coming up with some exotic combinations of gases, metals, and processes to actually squeeze excess electrical energy out of this phenomenon of nature.
In 1996, Paulo and Alexandra Correa received the first patent for such a device called the Pulsed Abnormal Glow Discharge Reactor, the first of its kind to convert plasma discharge directly into electricity.
This is a standard.
Utah inventor Paul Pantone has developed what he calls the GEAT fuel processor, a plasma generator similar to a super carburetor that actually appears to run on 80% water and is entirely non-polluting.
This device replaces the carburetor and exhaust and combines them as one unit, whereas this end of it acts as a miniature refinery, allowing the engine to run on everything from battery acid and water mixed to crude oil right out of the ground. This is Angola crude, a 39.5 gravity. The exhaust coming down goes around and comes out here at the far end. The center chamber draws some of the heat from the exhaust, plus this tube takes some of the exhaust gases, takes them up into the chamber and bubbles them down to the bottom. The bubbles, as it comes through the fuel, are brought up to the top of the chamber, picked up through a tube, and fed up the center of the exhaust pipe. While they're being fed up the exhaust pipe, they are in a vacuum, and there's a heat exchange which occurs. This process has been argued a few times to be either a plasma field, an electro field. We do know that it does have a slight radiation, which is not alpha, beta, or gamma, and we do have X-rays to show that whatever is coming from the unit does get affected different from stainless steel than the regular steel. Yep. When the temperature of the exhaust is the same as the air temperature going in from the air portion up here, normally 3% more oxygen coming out of the tailpipe than there is in the air we're breathing. And no carbon at all.
Carbon vanishes.
I wouldn't say vanishes, I would say transmuted into some other substance, a lighter element, because we have an abundance of lighter elements here that are not explained from down here. But during the heat process, there are molecular changes. After running this engine from 1983 until now, and many times we had it running 8.5 hours a day, we have never had to change the spark plug, change the oil, or clean it. We have taken the head off 3 times to inspect the inside of it, and it's been spotless.
What we have here is the Pantone GEAT device fitted to a Ford 2300cc 4-cylinder engine. As you can see, we have a see-through container here which holds the fuel. As the engine is started, air is drawn in by vacuum through the fuel and bubbles the fuel, the vapors of which are drawn off here. They travel down this hose into our reaction chamber. They go up the reaction chamber and return back out here to be to be taken into the engine through this tube. This is our air filter, and this tube is connected to another valve, which are controlled by this linkage, operating the air intake and the fuel intake. This is the valve that controls the return air going through this tube into the bubbler. During the testing with the 2300cc Pinto, we have achieved efficiency up to and including 300% of normal. If this engine normally got 20 miles to the gallon on the highway, you'd now be looking at 60. Our load tests and whatnot have not been completed, but we feel very confident that there's not going to be a power problem
out there that wasn't.
I witnessed the demonstrations by Paul Pantone, and I was astonished by the claim of ability to use any fuel, water, including mixed with oil and so forth. It's similar to something that's validated already by Gunnerman, that's being used in the state of Nevada at the moment. However, this is an even more shocking claim, because it appears that it is truly, if it's correct, and if it can be validated, he seems quite open, it appears that this may be yet another process which does some kind of transmutation of elements. He claims there's no carbon coming out of the exhaust, which would be unthinkable for putting a hydrocarbon fuel in, even if it's mixed with water. You have to get carbon out, and he's claiming that there are no CO or CO2 emissions from this, and there appear to be none visually. That is, there appear to be no soot particles coming out of the exhaust. So I hold out some hopes for this.
So our demonstration units that'll be going out to about 25,000 stations between now and the end of the year or early next year are being retrofit as we speak now to include our system in the exhaust pipe and our injector body here with standard equipment that normally is supplied from the factory so that we can get it out to the public as quickly as possible.
After being rejected by dozens of U.S. manufacturers, Pantone now has contracts with several major foreign countries. Recently, several U.S. companies have decided to take a second look.
And the fusion between these components.
In 1989, two physicists from the University of Utah, Dr. Stanley Pons and Dr. Martin Fleischmann, created a media frenzy with their announcement of cold fusion in a bottle. Although several independent experiments reported similar test results, the cry of fraud quickly went up at MIT and other prestigious universities. The debunking was swift and merciless.
Throughout the history of science, anytime there is something that is very threatening to the established ideas, such as Galileo's revelations through the telescope and his idea, following on others, that the Earth goes around the sun, not vice versa, continental drift, all sorts of claims that ultimately became validated. The initial reaction of science is to say this is nonsense and to reject it and not even to look at the data. And I would say that the cold fusion and free energy or new energy phenomena are so threatening to the underpinnings of modern physics and chemistry and all other sciences that you get the expected intensely negative reaction. The real story about cold fusion is that it never died. Soon after the announcement in Utah on March 23rd, 1989, hundreds, thousands of people all over the world, scientists and engineers, began to try to replicate the Pons and Fleischmann experiment. And positive results kept coming in of all manner, including the energy, the excess energy, far more out than in than could be possibly explained by any chemical reaction or any previously stored energy. The unfortunate situation was that the U.S. Department of Energy masterminded a bogus panel of so-called experts, many of whom were biased from the start against the subject. They came up with the expected answer within 3 months, and they ratified it within 6 months, even as the evidence continued.
Those physicists, nuclear physicists that have been working with hot fusion, the tokamaks, this type of thing, they have a monstrous amount of evidence that shows exactly what they expect to have happen with nuclear reactions in this hot gas plasma. They believe, and it's a good first guess, that the nuclear reactions that would occur in a cold fusion cell should be the same. Well, Mother Nature doesn't always accept our predispositions to belief. Therefore, Mother Nature says, this is a different environment, these are different reactions, and hey guys, start studying a little harder and find out what's going on. The problems that occur in evaluating a cold fusion device have not been so much, does it work, but does it work every time? And many scientists are of the opinion if it doesn't work every time, then there's something wrong. Basically, the problem has been in the preparation of the metal. Now, this is particularly true in the heavy water experiments of Pons and Fleischmann. Certain materials will just absolutely close off the effect of the cells. Other things, their refining additions, will promote the effect. So there's a lot of study going on in that area. So over 200 laboratories in over 30 countries have replicated or advanced or had successes in various types of cold fusion devices.
The Patterson Power Cell of Clean Energy Technologies of Dallas, Texas, is one of the most spectacular devices in the cold fusion field. It also happens to be the first device that has a United States patent, which is also very important. We got it almost by accident, since there are hundreds of patent applications that the patent office is rejecting. What this cell is it's very similar to the Pons and Fleischmann concept, except it uses tiny little metal-coated beads with either nickel, palladium nickel, or even sometimes just nickel, and ordinary water, not the heavy water, which Pons and Fleischmann started with. And it does produce, with a flowing stream of this liquid, or electrolyte, with just a little bit of lithium sulfate salt mixed in it, it produces spectacular energy. In fact, in one experiment, they turned the power off completely, and the cell continued to produce 20 watts of power, unmistakable, for at least 14 hours, and my understanding is that could go on for a number of days longer. The typical power ratios of this kind of a cell, it's very robust, totally repeatable, is anywhere from 10 to 1,000 to 1, okay, when you have even a tiny bit of input power. They've had to go over 1,000 watts with only a watt or so input electricity. Clearly, these cells can be made to self-sustain, that is, continue by themselves.
Dennis Cravens is an independent scientist who has done first-hand research studying the effects of the Patterson Power Cell.
The important thing is, notice over here, total excess energy is usually in the megajoules range. If you run through a chemical calculation of how much metal you have in there, about 20 milligrams, turn the crank, how many moles is that? How much? You assume about 100 kcal per mole for your chemist types of a typical energetic reaction, if you can think of one. We can't think of one, but if there was one, you maybe get 32 kcals if you burned all the metal. So we are 3 or 4 orders of magnitude more energy out of the system, integrated energy out, than if we were burning everything chemically. If you do the calculations, you'll find that you can get there. It's more likely that a few percentage of them are in the millions electron volt region.
It's been revealed recently that the Patterson cell will actually keep producing heat for at least 14 hours after it's shut off. This is a phenomenal discovery. It has not been advertised or publicized very well. But what that means is we're actually dealing with a free energy source. The inventors never use that phrase, and for obvious purposes, but the important thing is that it does need more understanding, and also it has the keys to our the type of device that we need. The interesting thing about the Patterson cell, too, is that as a byproduct, it produces hydrogen and oxygen. It's actually using water, any type of water, and electrolyzing that water, and then just exhausting the hydrogen and oxygen. Now, we could see two views of that. For example, if we're actually forced into a situation where we're in an enclosed space and not able to spend too much time outdoors, which we already spend 90% indoors anyways, the supply of oxygen is very valuable, whether or not we even use the hydrogen. But it's possible we could also store the hydrogen and therefore have hydrogen-powered vehicles and use the oxygen indoors.
Another area that has emerged as a result of cold fusion, which is every bit as heretical and disastrous to the scientific enterprise as the over-unity and the greater energy out than in, is the transmutation of metals, that is heavy metals. In ordinary cold fusion experiments, they have now seen in the metal changes in elements. For example, the production of copper, the production of other isotopes, such as rhodium, the change of palladium into other things. This is confirmed, there's no doubt about it, and it's occurring with minimal energy input. So what this leads to is an analogy with the old claims of the alchemists, who were able, historically, they said, and there's some evidence that they were able to do it, to do low energy processes that produced gold from lead or mercury or other things. This is now being done in laboratories, and every instance I know of in the history of science where a small effect was seen initially to produce something was later scaled up. So it's quite possible that our culture will enter an age of alchemy in which low energy processes can make precious metals.
As we look toward the future, I believe we'll be able to find ways in which we can create the kind of elements that we need by these low energy nuclear reactions. I think we'll be able to start adding to or picking apart or changing the nucleus of atoms to be able to get the kind of stable atoms that we need. But more important, I thoroughly believe that we will be able to take the radioactive materials, add a proton or add some changes to it, and make those radioactive materials non-radioactive. And that is going to be a great boon to our present, to clean up the mess that we've left behind from our atomic bombs, from our nuclear power plants, and of course from things like Chernobyl. So in the future, we have laid the groundwork with cold fusion by which we'll be able to handle a whole array of nuclear changes that heretofore have been outside of the current model of what can be done with nuclear reactions.
There are many power companies throughout the United States that are now on alert, and they're sending their representatives to cold fusion conferences. We meet them all the time. They give support. They really will be the vanguard of the new energy age. I believe that any utility company that does not get into this now is doomed, because frankly, when we have generators of electricity and heat that can stay in a home or a building, why would anyone want to be plugged into the grid, the wire grid, any longer? This would make no sense. People will argue against that, but I think the grid will disappear.
A remarkable process for sure, and one that offers exciting developments in the near future. But does the task of extracting energy from our environment really require such exotic, ultra-advanced technology that potentially would still put it under the control of large profit-driven interests. The rare metal palladium still have to be prospected, mined, and purified. Or are there simpler in design, low-maintenance technologies available that could be bought off the shelf and installed by anyone for an affordable one-time fee? We're going to look in depth at several individuals and companies who have been working for years perfecting devices that they claim will do just that. No one person in the free energy field has been as determined and persistent as Mississippi inventor Joseph Newman. Since the 70s, Newman has been denied U.S. patents repeatedly on his energy machine, even though numerous engineers, scientists, and even congressmen have testified on his behalf.
In 1968, I invented a bike that would get a wheelie. And I used an 80-pound flywheel that I had built and took a positive clutch out of a 30-horsepower motor, put it above the axis of the back wheel. A kid would get up on it, build up inertia in that 80-pound flywheel. He'd engage that positive clutch. Immediately, the front end would jump up off the ground. It'd leave black streaks on the pavement about that long, and the kids' eyes would get as big as a silver dollar. They were just ecstatic over it. But I had heard the word that a gyroscope was a stabilizer. So I went to the library, got a book on gyroscopes. And when I started reading the mechanical characteristics of a gyroscope, the question that had dogged my mind for 3 years, how did that current know which direction to go? And why was it when you went parallel you'd get nothing? I saw the laws of a gyroscope match that exactly. If you study the laws of a gyroscope, if you take this little gyroscope here, if I can spin it up, you can see that it does, but I think every kid knows it's true. Now, if you pivot that one direction, it goes one way. You pivot the other way, it goes the other way. If I turn it around 180 degrees, now if I push it up, it goes the opposite direction. Push it up, it goes the opposite direction. If I go parallel, it does not pivot, as long as I maintain a parallel position. That's exactly what happens when you move a conductor through a magnetic field. You push down on it, the current goes in one direction. You push up, it goes in the opposite direction. You turn the magnet over 180 degrees, everything will reverse. You push down parallel to the lines of force with the copper wire, and you get nothing. It told me that the energy in a magnetic field was a gyroscopic particle. Now, I didn't care what the rest of the world was saying because they couldn't answer my honest question. It was obvious to me the energy in a magnetic field consists of gyroscopic particles. It is the mechanical essence of Einstein's equation of E equals mc squared. It moves forward at c and it spins at c. That's Einstein's equation of E equals mc squared. It only occurs when you get atom alignment in material. I don't care if it's conductor or iron, what it is. When the atoms align, the magnetic field will appear, come outside the boundaries of the material, and gives you a running river that you can tap into. And what I'm going to show you is an energy technology that's going to totally change your life, that the status quo power brokers have been fighting, and I'll show you the history of it. They didn't want you to have it, but you can see for yourself that this works. And the part of this for you to see it is to watch these meters, because these meters are going to show you there's more power in this system than flows from this battery. The magnet runs down this shaft from one end to the other. It's hex shaped with six-sided. This blue represents a coil running this way. The red represents a coil running at right angles to it. The commutator shows that you break that circuit every 90 degrees. So you fire into one coil, fire into the next coil. Now you notice this gets higher as it's running, because the batteries start getting charged. Now this one's going from 200 up to 400. You see that there's more current being produced by this system than those batteries are capable of delivering, because batteries will not produce RF power. So the RF power must be coming from the motor. Now RF power is true power, and the way you know this meter only works by converting the heat, and the heat is converted into electricity because it runs through a resistor. It's a very accurate measuring device. So you're well over twice the current is flowing in this system, and these batteries are capable of delivering. And the batteries cannot produce RF power. Now, this is real power. It has to be coming from the system. It clearly shows that the energy output of the system is greater than the energy inputted into the system. And that's what I've been saying. That's what's more than 30 scientists who came to my home from around the world. Some of them came all the way from England, signed affidavits that the invention worked. The special master to the court, Mr. William Schuyler, who was a former commissioner of patents. He was an electrical engineer. The federal judge chose him, saying his credentials were superb. He looked at those affidavits and gave the men the credit they were due. He said the evidence was overwhelming. The invention worked. There was no contradictory factual evidence, and the patent office had knowingly not followed the formalities of the patent law. To us as an observer, we see everything as motionless. We see objects and they sit still, and everything in the shop sits still. And so we think that's, to us, again as to the observer, we think the natural state of our planet is non-motion. But when in reality you get down to the basic makeup of the atoms of this material, and you see that the natural state of the universe is motion. The unnatural state is what I have concluded is the lack of motion to the observer, because that's when it forms into something and becomes a solid mass that will be interreacted by other masses sitting close to it. It causes it to sit still and not be able to travel because of its attraction. So we come along as the observer and we say the natural state of the planets and the universe is lack of motion. Just like we believe that so strongly, just several hundred years ago, we believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, and that we were everything, and they even believed that the stars, even back to Kepler times, was only like a cake full of raisins 3 miles thick, and the stars were little tiny raisins in it. And that was our bias and our prejudice based on what we saw, that everything should centralize around us. And I'm saying now we should open our eyes and our brain to see the magnitude of what lays in front of us. Space travel will become a reality. Our children growing up will have an excitement and a universe to travel into, but the values of the human race has to change with that.
While Joe Newman is still fighting for recognition and just compensation, many entrepreneurs are racing to be the first into the marketplace with magnetic motors that are built with high-tech space-age materials and employ microprocessors to regulate pulsations and RPM. David Porter of Galtech Semiconductors demonstrates his recently patented permanent magnet motor called the carousel electric generator.
This is the latest version of the carousel motor generator. It's a rotary version. Rotary inside. There's 18 separate sections, what we call a coil section in here. 18 make up the outer diameter. There's 6 coils here that we're using to drive the motor. On the top here we have an encoder which sends a pulse down to the electronics and basically lets the electronics know where the rotor, the rotating part here, is in relationship to the coils, and tells the coils when to turn on and off. That's done by a specific index point that the encoder has that sets the relationship between the two. And the electronics down here in the box is basically a set of TTL logic counters. It counts the number of pulses from the encoder, and it turns the power on and off to different coils depending on where the rotor is at the time. We have also hooked up to this system a connection to the computer over here. What it gives us the opportunity to do is change the duty cycle on the system. We can change it from a pulse rate of 1 pulse per cycle up to 40 pulses per cycle, which would be 100% duty cycle. That is incorporated in, and what we do is change the pulse rate on the computer. It downloads the data to the electronics. When the index pulse comes around, which comes around once per revolution, it updates the data in the counters, and that's what changes the pulse rate on the system. Yeah, we don't have an automatic start on the system right now. That's something that the Intel chip will do. We'll start it up at a pulse rate of approximately 13 pulses, which gives us a 16% duty cycle. It takes a while to spool up because, like I say, it works also as its own flywheel. So we build up the power gradually. The thing about this system is that everything floats on the magnetic field in there. You have very little internal friction. Once the system gets up to speed, it stabilizes at a certain RPM. Right now we're running at about a 30% duty cycle per channel. The speed is still coming up a little bit. Calculate the speed off of the scope here, and we're running about 1,850 RPM. This white and the green shows the two channels on the motor. The little spikes there are the amount of time that each channel is on, and the flat part at the bottom is the amount that it's off. So you can see how much is pulsing and how much time it's off and how much time it's on. One of the analogies we like to use is it's like if you pick someone up and take them across the street, you use a lot of energy. If you put them in a tire, once you get it started, all you got to do is tap it a little bit. And so you use a lot less energy to move the same load. And that's what we do. We build it up to a high speed, and then we just tap it with a little juice as it goes around. And we use the inertia built into the system to take it the rest of the way there. So we're using a high-speed pulse on the system. What we're doing is removing the energy from the magnet. The magnet has a specific life. They lose approximately 1% a year. So we're not actually trying to create energy from nothing. The system will not run forever. It's not perpetual motion. We use the amount of energy that is in the magnets. Once that energy is used up, the magnets can be taken out, they can be recharged. All we're doing is maximizing the efficiency of the electromagnetic flux density that's there to the production of electrical output.
When will we be able to see free energy devices powering consumer products like this electric car? Well, they're already here, and you may be able to purchase one by the time you see this program.
In Oklahoma, where oil has been king for over a century, inventor Troy Reed has been busy in his shop constructing rotating magnetic motors that he believes will soon revolutionize how we get around.
And it does work. This is a new prototype of the magnetic motor, and if I can explain a little bit about what you call a magnetic field. All magnets, the big old wooden prototype, has a system. As the motor went over, it had a tension to jerk over like that. If you take this motor here and you take your finger and rotate it, it doesn't have that jerking in it. So what I've done, I got rid of the crankshaft. I've got rid of the injectors, and the system in this motor here, as you crank this motor up, and like you do the other one, the motor will start running, and what I'll do, I'll energize it on this motor here. If you can see these amp gauges over here, this will come, when we get it up to about 150 volts, we'll unplug it and we'll turn the light on. If you turn this around where you can see this side here, all the working parts is behind this system here, operates from a little computer. Takes just 5 volts. It's 150 volts. What we're going to do, turn off all the switches, make sure there ain't nothing plugged into it. There's the plug. There's your 110 volts. Motor still running. You can operate this table plumb around. Still got energy running. Nothing tied up in the back of it. Nothing on the floor. rotate around, still running electricity. So we're looking, hoping this time next year that you'll be able to use it in your home. So that's another. And what's good about this, you're talking about electric automobiles, this right here can sit in the back of an electric automobile and generate electricity and charge batteries up in a car. Beautiful automobile. You can drive it anywhere you want to. You don't pollute the air. All the other electric automobiles that I've actually seen has been nothing but this standard transmission. This is an automatic transmission car. There's not a whole lot of what you call junk, I would call, under cars. I've seen a lot of electric cars that had a lot of stuff in it. The only thing that this has a battery to run the radio, the blower. We've got 2 safety switches over here that can be mounted into an enclosed system, but we did this where you could see, where people can see this car with the technology. It's a safety switch system. This is a controller box, a Curtis control box. It cuts the amperage down. So with the amperage, here's what's real good about electric automobiles. All electric automobiles that have surge technology with this in it, they create heat. They've got to have a fan to blow this Curtis controller on because it gets hot. We don't want that to get hot. We want to stay that cold, because once it stays cold, you save on all the computer chips that's in this controller. So that means you can go farther, longer, and you won't have no problems. This electric automobile has got 2 gauges in front of the shifter on the automatic transmission. It's called the voltage and the amperage. That's what I was talking about earlier about amperage on automobiles. Let's see if we can't get the amperage to go down instead of going up. The voltage on this here should say somewhere around 120 volts. When we start out, there's no amperage at all. So the gauges is down below here, and we're getting ready to take and go drive the car, and you can see for yourself what it does. All you do is to take and put it in gear, and the motor sounds like a little sports car. Shifts, runs good, fantastic automobile, drives. If you'll see the amperage on the gauge, see it going down? Amperage goes way down. That's what I like about electric cars. If you floorboard the car, the most it will do would just be about maybe 100 amps. And that's what we want to do, is to keep the amperage down on an electric car. So it'll go anywhere really anybody wants to go. If you want to take a trip, you don't have to worry about going to go plug in the house, because it's called the surge technology. It's a beautiful automobile, and I love it, and I put a lot of hard work in this car, and we're going to make it. No oil, no gas to fool with. And the technology is here. It's going to be here. It's going to go. It's going to work beautiful for the whole world, for mankind. See you around. This is your future, people.
As we have seen so far, electromagnetism seems to be offering the most viable path for many contemporary inventors. The magnetic motor continues to challenge the over-unity barrier, but even simpler methods are being demonstrated through common ingenuity. Dennis Lee of Better World Technology has been struggling to pursue his dream of achieving energy independence for everyone on the planet. Held in prison for 2 years without ever being convicted of a crime, Lee mounts public demonstrations in major U.S. cities, lining up individual dealerships to market his devices. A controversial figure, who some dismiss as a fraud, and others see as legitimate, if outspoken, P.T. Barnum of free power to the people, Lee has assembled an impressive line of prototypes and processes, including those by other inventors like Yul Brown. Although he claims his machines are not utilizing zero-point energy because they draw heat from the surrounding air, his numerous devices supposedly achieve super efficiency rates by recycling excess energy through closed-loop systems.
I built the world's most efficient heat pump and developed it, and these are the evaporators for that heat pump right here. They're 8 feet high, 3 feet wide. Now, the refrigerant we put in here boils at 40 degrees below zero. Therefore, anytime, day or night, outside in a rainstorm or in a windstorm, a hailstorm or a snowstorm, or just out on a nice hot sunny day or in the middle of a cold night, as long as the refrigerant that's inside this panel is colder than whatever the air is out here or the phenomenon that's hitting this panel, then the heat from the air or the sun or the wind or the rain or the sleet or the snow will be transferred into the refrigerant on the other side, because it's the second law of thermodynamics. Hot goes to cold. So if this is the coldest thing outside, anything out there that touches it is going to give its heat to it. A little bit of heat goes a long way. That gas starts expanding like crazy, and as it expands, it then is drawn into the compressor, not through suction. I've got engineers and inventors that don't like to use the term suction, but through negative pressure. So as the compressor is creating this negative pressure, the gas is migrating to it. And so a compressor is a gas pump. It'll pump gas. And so the gas is being pumped by the compressor into the compressor, elevated in temperature. And even though if you touch this panel, it's ice cold to your hand, and if you touch the line going out of the panel, it's still ice cold to your hand. When it hits that compressor, the compressor takes all the gas in this space, puts it in that space, elevates the pressure and the temperature. Going out of the compressor, do not touch that line whenever that thing is on, because it's 200 to 250 degrees hot. And so that's where we get the heat. All of the heat is transferred in here. We then use a compressor to take the relatively useless energy that we've got and elevate the temperature and pressure and make it very useful energy. Then that heat would be transferred later. This is a direct drive compressor. This direct drive compressor takes Freon from the panels, and it runs that because this direct drive is causing the pistons to go up and down. That gives us heat into the boiler. The boiler expands the other Freon back through that into a double-acting piston that's going back and forth. We're converting with mechanical apparatuses, we're converting that into shaft rotation. That shaft rotation turns this wheel. As this wheel turns, it causes the compressor to turn. As the compressor supplies the heat, it causes this wheel to turn. You might say these two wheels are powering each other. And by the way, once the Freon has taken the heat, it then made the power, it then goes up here. This is a condenser. We're sucking water out of the bottom of the tank, could be the well. And we're running the water through this pump right here that's also driven by this same drive mechanism, running the water into this condenser. It's the world's most efficient condenser at 100 degree delta T, 6 million BTUs. And as we're then running the water through, we're making the water hotter, but the water will also be being pumped. And as I do this, I'll show you the water being pumped. And then also, we're cooling down the Freon, which is going into this canister and is being pumped right back into the boiler by a little trombone pump that's running on the same cylinder. You ready to try it? Let's go ahead and try it. Let's turn it on, guys. Okay, if you're ready, Maestro, anytime you're ready. Okay. So it is pumping water from energy taken out of the air, and we'll light the lights too from excess energy. So the lights are being lit from excess energy from the air. They're pulsing. It wasn't set up to do that, so we don't have it stable, but we thought we'd just demonstrate the excess power that we have. Main thing is it's pumping water. It's supposed to be pumping water. That's a closed loop because it's continuing to go through the boiler and then back. I had a heat pump in a walk-in freezer. We cranked the temperature down to 20 degrees below zero in dead airspace. Now imagine this, if you got any background in refrigeration, we're in dead airspace, the temperature is 20 below zero. We did it every single Saturday for an entire year. People from all over the world came to see it. We said, bring your own test equipment, take the thing apart if you want to. We had a $10,000 challenge to find any gimmick or anything in it. And every single weekend,
We cranked the temperature down to 20 below in dead airspace, and we made water hot enough to burn your hand from energy we took out of that box at 20 below at a 2-to-1 COP. Same average performance of the GE heat pump in America. Only it's 20 below in dead airspace. And we challenged all the heat pump manufacturers to come anytime you want to, either find a hoax with us or bring your unit down and see if you can do that. Nobody ever came. A lot of customers came, lots of people from all over the world came, Pakistan, everywhere. So anyway, we're in here testing this every year, every weekend for a year. And a man came to the show one day, and what a guy this was. Now, we're trying to build this thing. It's going to take 2 years and $2 million, and I'm raising capital selling heat pump things to get the money. And a guy walks in, and he comes up to me at the end of the show, and he says, Mr. Lee, I am absolutely astonished. I want to shake your hand, and I want to tell you, I have no doubt you have got the best heating system in the world. Yours tops everything out there from solar all the way down the line. You did it. But you need to know me. You know why you need to know me? Because I have built the world's most efficient heat engine, and you have got the world's most efficient heat source. He says, if we got together with our two technologies, we could become the most dangerous men in the world. I thought, wow, I've never been the most dangerous man in the world. I've kind of wanted to be. And so, you see, this man's name was Dr. Fisher. Now, this guy proved that they built the steam engine wrong. I had the pleasure of building his unit in my research lab, and we took his great big unit, because why wouldn't I want a great big one? I don't want to put everybody on the grid system with a new system that can exploit them some more with all the arrogance that comes with it. I wanted to give people the opportunity to be totally independent of the grid system. Remember, that was my goal. So we took the big one we had and we scaled it down into a model not much, a little bit smaller than this one. It was a little smaller than this. It was about that long. It's about 13 inches long, 6 inches in diameter. And that one was going to be big enough to be able to power all the energy you needed for your house, and so I didn't want one bigger than that. And by the way, that little unit could fit in the glove compartment of any American-made car. I went across the United States of America telling my story. I told it in every state of the United States, and I got 1,000 people to join me telling my story. We put a media ad campaign together because the media wouldn't cover it, so we ran commercials. And we did a 60-second commercial cutting a power line and saying you can power your house with no electricity, external electricity, run your car with a new engine that runs with no gasoline. We did a 60-second commercial nationwide. As far as we can tell, about 10 million people saw it. And after that happened, that was too much. That couldn't be tolerated. And so I got a letter from the state of California inviting me to come back to California to go to court. So I flew back from New Jersey to California to go to court, and when I walked into the court, the judge said, "You're probably wondering why you're here," and I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, because I've been ordered by the state of California to put you in prison." And I said, "Well, that's really interesting. You're putting me in prison, but I've never been convicted of the crime. How do I go to prison without a trial and without being convicted?" And I said, "You can't do that, can you?" And he said, "Well," he says, "I've been ordered by the state of California to put you in prison, so that's where you're going, but sounds like you got a hell of a case for appeal." That, by the way, is a quote, and I do have the transcript. I walked out of prison 2 years ago, and now we have rebuilt our whole national network of distribution of distributors. We're in every state of the United States. We're in every major county of the United States. We have people now who understand exactly how the government works, exactly how the big boys work, exactly how the energy companies work, and we've got it all figured out. And we've got far, far, far more technology than we ever had in 1987. We got a lot more money than we ever had in 1987, and we're about to rock your world.
As if the amazing over-unity results of these pioneering inventions are not enough, a curious combination of side effects to free energy research involves such things as the transmutation of metals, the formation of new isotopes, and yes, even anti-gravity. Levitation effects from spinning magnetic disks conjure up images of UFOs hovering in midair. British inventor John Searle has led the way along these lines, but his technique is not the only approach. The remarkable works of Canadian inventor John Hutchison has drawn widespread attention from businessmen and government scientists since 1979, when he began using ultra-high electromagnetic frequencies to transform matter in some very unusual ways. It has come to be known as the Hutchison effect.
The objects you're seeing moving there is a form of levitation by translational movement, meaning that the objects become lighter and can float around. The heaviest being the barium cylinder that you see there with the two wires coming out of it. Tends to slide around on 7 pounds of its own weight. Physics of it is self-resonation of what they call ferromagnetic and piezoelectric barium titanate through a power amplifier and broad and narrow bands of electrical energy going into this crystal. So the applications of this in advanced applications using free energy or zero-point energy to power it would be in propulsion technologies. This is a crystal converter unit that I made about a year ago to see if the principle worked, and indeed it seems to work to this day. The principles involve the Casimir effect and space charge type of barrier technology in semiconductors, and a jitter activity called zero-point energy that goes through time and space. The idea is to get the material inside this to interface with the jittering action of zero-point energy. And moving on to what they may look like inside, I actually bring out a piece here of this material, of common minerals and that, produced in a special way, and I take a reading here. And I should be getting a higher reading. I had a hot spot somewhere on here. I have here almost a ½ volt, as you can see. As one can see, there's no batteries in this or anything else except just crystalline material with different configurations. And this is a steady state. It's always that, and has been tested up to a year's time and under stress tests also. So, which made me decide to then, of course, mount the same material in cylinders. Different cylinders, of course, there are different mixes in there, and I found that that some of the cylinders are not as powerful as this material here, or this very tiny one here. Actually, this has more power than this large artillery shell unit here. And what I want to do, of course, is to demonstrate it in the sense of it making actual power. That means to turn a small motor. Okay, I'm attaching this to the base here, another lead at the top, and it should spin, which it does. So yeah, basically, this kind of material powering motors. Of course, it's a very small motor at this time, but scaled up in larger amounts of material can power up to several horsepower if needed.
Hutchison hopes his simple shake-and-bake method of producing these crystal energy converters will attract investors who can see the potential of permanent batteries which never need charging.
Non-toxic, that will interface with zero-point energy in space and time.
Hutchison's more dramatic experiments border on the paranormal and have generated more than just a passing interest from U.S. military research labs.
We've had about 750 demonstrations of levitations, translational movements, metallurgical samples falling apart, changing into transmuted unknown metals. Quite a variety of obscure types of effects, wood impregnated into metals, other objects in metals, monopole magnetic fields, written up in many journals. Quite a host, or a Pandora's box, of different types of effects on the outer edge of the scientific community.
In this remarkable series of video clips shot by Hutchison, we see what happens when he fine-tunes the electromagnetic frequencies aimed at target objects in his garage.
On the subatomic level, I feel that there is a dimension shift activated by very conventional electrostatics, RF fields that I use, and Tesla waves that I use, that actually form a keyway that opens up another area of time and space that may activate the zero-point energy fields and interdimensional reactions, let's say, to gravitational waves and time waves, or chronons, if you wish. Perhaps we're dealing in chronons and gravitons, which are maybe particles, and somehow causing a distortion, which causes objects to simply break apart or pulsate in the center of stainless steel bars and fall apart, or to become weightless.
Here, ice cream in a plastic cup. Finally, a 70-pound cannonball.
What is interesting and also frustrating about his invention is that he's using a combination of Tesla coil and Van de Graaff to produce a very disruptive and lifting experiments, which in one case, for example, actually lifts a 19-pound bushing toward the ceiling just from electromagnetic fields. Now, when we analyze that, we find that there's position versus time graph that we can plot, and also the velocity versus time. But when we actually analyze the acceleration versus time, it's an increasing straight line. So we're forced as scientists to admit that we have a third derivative effect, which, for my mind, actually lends itself to an anomalous new force, which I call hyperforce, because we have to take a derivative of that to finally get a flat, straight line, a constantly increasing acceleration. So the Hutchison effect has been used as a benchmark for a comparison to many other high voltage propulsion devices. Electrogravity, in other words.
Now that we've witnessed the awesome potential of these revolutionary new energy sources, some interesting questions begin to surface. What are the consequences to the environment, to the very fabric of space-time itself, once we begin harnessing these little understood forces on a planetary scale? Remember the promise of nuclear energy? that electricity would be too cheap to meter? Are there downsides to tapping free energy that we may not be able to predict until it may be too late?
We have effects which can get down now into the very fundamental thing that drives everything, the mind stuff, the connection of the mind to the body and everything. For example, if you were to generate extreme pulses, extreme powerful pulses of this so-called scalar potential stuff with the hidden internal stuff, if you jerk that or hard enough, you jerk the normal smooth flow time stream, and what you really do is you snap the body loose from its mind connection. You jerk the two loose from each other. That's instantaneous death at every level. Every cell dies, every germ dies, every paramecium dies, every virus dies, the whole body dies. So obviously if you're going to try to think of energy in those enormous amounts, you're going to be extremely careful. You can't do that just willy-nilly without risking terrible effects from it. So there are some limitations that will emerge on this technology.
There is a danger, however, that you may tap too much zero-point energy, and then, of course, these things would heat up and explode, which has happened a few times with these devices of mine. So, in essence, it's an interesting technology to get involved in, but I notice that there's some precautions one needs to take. If you're having too much drawing from the electromagnetic jitter of zero-point energy, you're going to get a minor meltdown. And I had to clean this area out here once because of a minor meltdown.
Would a new energy source be dangerous, for example? I would say, of course, you have to respect it. I mean, it's energy, so therefore, it's always potentially dangerous. It's double-edged. And I think it would take a healthy respect to investigate it. One should be cautious, and that's very reasonable. I've heard some good things. I've heard there could be health effects. There could be good effects as well as the potential for detrimental effects. I think it's like anything else. It's energy. It could be used for good. It could be used for bad. It's up to us.
Perhaps because of their traditional understanding of invisible forces like chi or ki, Oriental cultures, especially the techno-enthusiastic Japanese, embrace the concept of free energy. Well-respected scientists like Shinichi Seki and Seihuji Inomata are receiving substantial government and industry support.
Meanwhile, the Japanese, of course, are beginning to commercially develop various systems. For example, a Japanese consortium funds the Pons and Fleshman work. The Japanese Toshiba Corporation is working with Inomata, and various other corporations are coming together to develop free energy options. And of course, Japan has no vested interest in the oil. They don't have any domestic source. So it's in their best interest to be the first kid on the block to make little gizmos that will replace our circuit breakers and internal combustion engines.
To understand this machine, you need, mind change, paradigm shift in yourself. So far, physics, ordinary science, consider only material world. But we should think another world as an unseen world. And we should recognize that unseen world and material world is connected. This energy comes from the other dimension.
We'll really have a true science when it is accepted in science, and a true technology when all the phenomenology is thoroughly worked out and thoroughly understood, when all the models are redone so that we adequately can model this theoretically and we can do engineering. We can sit down and design the circuits. They'll work every time. We'll have components on the shelf we can buy, assemble, and they work. We're not at that stage today. We are at a stage today which is the birth of the baby. We're not at the stage where it's already a teenager running around playing baseball on the baseball lot. We're at the birth of the baby, and the birth is very difficult because it's opposed by so many interests. The orthodox scientific community still very adamantly oppose it because they think that it's nonsense. They think that it's this old idea of perpetual motion in a closed system, creating energy from nothing. And that is nonsense. You can't do that. There are very strong and very powerful economic interests in the world, probably the strongest economic interest in the world, which are adamantly opposed to it. Can you see what this does to the oil-rich nations? Can you see eventually, can you see what this will do to many things? Now, actually, what it'll do, you'll phase the oil. Petrochemical industry won't go away. You still need the oil for the materials that's in it and the chemicals. And so it'll be more and more petrochemical industry rather than keep burning and wasting the oil and putting all the pollutants in the biosphere. So many things will readjust. It's going to wrest control from a lot of the great wealthy control barons who now dominate largely the economic world. And their world is going to change. Now, what you're going to see, I would predict, and we'll see if history bears this out, when those barons really realize that this stuff is for real and it can be made to work, and with the internet and with free publishing and computers and everything, they can no longer contain the information, and it's very embarrassing to keep killing the inventors. They stopped that about 15 years ago. At some point, you're going to see an overwhelming availability of funds become available. When the funds become available, the scientists will change over into it because they go where the money goes. They're bought and paid for, simple as that. You can't do research unless you got the funds. You cut off the research grants, professor gets without a job. He leaves the university. And so science is simply bought and paid for in this country and much of the world. When the money goes, the science will go to it. Now that will put the sharp young graduate students on it finally with some funds to do the experiments and work on their doctorates and so forth. You will have a very rapid assimilation and advancement of a totally new and extended electromagnetic science at the time.
You get to a certain stage in scientific development, sometimes to stages where you're faced with problems and barriers and you sort of forced to rethink and go in different directions. I think we're seeing that one of those peculiar time periods in the history of science where we're going to overturn some cherished models, not too much, but make some changes, and they'll open the door to an enormous amount of new technology in electricity and magnetism, in nuclear reactions, in motor development, in battery applications, in space flight, perhaps in anti-gravity. I think there are, in creating scarce elements from plentiful elements, I think we have just reached a plateau now where the world's door is opening to, what, a millennium of new science?
We're talking about real-life hardware. We're talking about experiments in science that are telling us beyond any reasonable doubt that we have technologies that will enable us to be free from the bondage that we now feel, free from some of these economic constraints that we've created for ourselves. Because you see, if energy is free, and it will be very shortly, food is free, housing is free, then we're free to create express our creative gifts and not be like drones. And we're also free to explore our greater selves. And it's going to be a very exciting time coming up.
The future of the world, as seen by conventional thinkers or even many far-reaching thinkers, is tame compared to what a cold fusion and free energy is going to do. No aspect of human culture will be untouched by this energy revolution. The very fact that the material that covers 70% of the planet's surface will now be available as a fuel source, and the fact that water makes up a huge percentage of our bodies, and this is a fuel and a source of energy, this is going to have incredible psychological and religious and historical and geopolitical implications. The Middle East picture and the strength of the oil interests there is going to be drastically altered. Air pollution will be abolished in most cities that are now affected by the internal combustion engine. And space travel, which is a favorite subject of mine, will be transformed. The ability to travel to the planets and to the stars will be given a gigantic boost, one that I never in my lifetime expected as an engineer who deals with those things.
Some people are saying that the title of my book, The Coming Energy Revolution, is a bit fearsome, that revolution implies a sudden radical change, and that the status quo will suffer, and that people whose jobs depend on the status quo will suffer. So perhaps evolution is a better way to look at it. But one way or another, our leaders, our political leaders, our business leaders, our utility company executives have to address the changeover to clean energy sources. And it'll probably come from abroad, so it probably will happen fairly fast. I'm not really concerned myself about a radical shift because people seem to be on the verge of readiness for change. A lot of fear, but also some positive anticipation. And maybe it takes an unraveling of what we have to put together a cleaner, more sane world.
Is mankind ready? Do we have the maturity to handle it? Are we giving matches to a baby? That's the question. Well, the first answer is we're kind of backing ourselves against the wall. If we maintain the status quo, we're doomed anyway. It looks like we're going to get a shot by having this energy available to us. If we're not mature enough to handle it, well, I guess we're doomed either way. We have a chance to survive, a chance to go on, but it will take, in a way, a consciousness transformation. Understand there's a consciousness movement and things like that, that people are starting to wake up. It's not just a me game now, it's a we game. And as we learn to work together and have empathy for one another, we can transcend the old selfish consciousness, which has caused all the problems and all the wars and everything else, into a recognition that we are a planetary being.
We've only been able to present a handful of inventors and their remarkable devices in this program. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people worldwide, scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, who are actively working right now, researching and developing this phenomenal technology to the point where it can be successfully scaled up and mass marketed. We are at a pivotal crossroads in human history. Can we as a society release our fears associated with the violence of the past and embrace the unknown? Can we cast aside our rigid skepticism in favor of an open-minded spirit of inquisitiveness? Our very survival may depend on how we answer these questions. We hope we've given you enough of the necessary information with which you may base your future decisions regarding this exciting new field, one that will soon affect all of our lives and the very fate of our planet Earth as well. I'll see you at the finish line. The race is on.
If you were fascinated by the amazing technologies and concepts you've just witnessed, now you can get even more valuable information and details from the New Energy series. 5 full-length videos, 9 hours of in-depth conversations and demonstrations of free energy systems. Explore the worlds of inventors and theoretical physicists who are changing the paradigms of science. Volume 1 features Tom Bearden.
In particle physics, any electrical charge is automatically a broken symmetry. Now what this means is there is a virtual photon flux, a violent flux exchange between the vacuum itself, which is filled with this virtual photon flux.
Volume 2, John Hutchison.
I feel that that is also true. I think the mind can act as also a cohere of frequencies and transmit them out and then lock this doorway into space and time.
This motor here drew 12.5 amps.
Volume 3, Joseph Newman.
This motor right here only draws 7.5 amps. And look at the size of the propeller. Look at the size of the propeller. Look at the size of the motor. Look at the size of the motor. Now this is exactly what I teach throughout my book. I taught it to Dr. Hastings. I've taught it to the world. That the larger you make the mass, then the smaller amount of power it will take and the more power it will produce.
Volume 4 highlights Troy Reed.
This is an old mechanical device. It's got 2 inner wheels on the inside and 2 outer shell wheels with magnets. They got 8 magnets on this side, 8 magnets on the inside here.
Let's see what kind of torque we got at 75 psi.
And Volume 5, Dennis Lee.
Okay, here goes. Maxed it out. So it went all the way off the end of this thing, 150 foot-pounds of torque. This engine.
They're just $29.95 for each take.
Now the process
or get all 5 for $119.95, a savings of $30. Place your order today. Call 1-800-795-TAPE, T-A-P-E. Or write to Lightworks Audio and Video, Post Office Box 661593, Los Angeles, California, 90066.
He was a seer, a visionary, the inventor of remote control. The motors that we use today,
the wireless transmission of radio signals.
Electricity available 24/7, anywhere you live on the Earth.
Even more than the 20th century.
The man of the 20th century. Many might still know who he was, but his name surely rings a bell, and they are certainly familiar with his incredible inventions. Nikola Tesla is the man who had lit the previous century and bridged the gap leading into the next, with over 900 patents approved across his lifetime. We owe him everything from LED lights, alternating current, Tesla turbine, Tesla coil, radio and remote control, the magnifying transmitter, neon lamp, X-rays, Adams power plant transformer house, induction motor, electric cars, robotics, laser, wireless communications and limitless free energy, artificial tidal wave to electric-powered supersonic airship or death beam, and many, many other patents.
Tesla was making very substantial claims about so-called teleforce rays that could bring down airplanes from thousands of miles away.
His interest in building what we now call robots, but he built that remote control boat 2 decades before the word robot was even coined.
He was working on radio-controlled torpedoes, robot ships, all sorts of things.
And these are all inventions on the surface. Inventions that humans at that stage of evolution could grasp and understand. However, few people know that Nikola Tesla had tapped into a source of unlimited energy.
He thought that the Earth itself was like a giant condenser, that the Earth contained a great deal of natural energy,
and was on the verge of handing the people of this planet a gift of free energy until the powers that be had stopped him in his tracks. The most important thing Tesla required in order to accomplish his plan was funding. He was an inventor, not a businessman. So during his lifetime, he came across various hurdles that would hinder his progress towards the future he envisioned for humanity. Even so, Tesla pursued his dreams until his final hour. Not only he wished to give free, wireless energy to the world, he also wanted to establish long-lasting peace on Earth. For this goal alone, he designed the perfect plan. He would engineer a weapon so powerful that its energy bursts would bring down a fleet of 10,000 enemy airplanes at a distance of 200 miles from a defending nation's border, and will cause armies to drop dead in their tracks.
Tesla claimed that his death beam would be able to destroy an attacking enemy air fleet. He said that this would also be able to stop an enemy army, up to 1 million men.
By constructing this tremendously powerful apparatus and distributing it to all leading nations, he would ensure that war would not make sense anymore, since everyone would have an impenetrable offensive and defensive force. Tesla thought that by selling his invention to the world's superpowers, he would receive the funding required to carry on with his ultimate experiment of generating unlimited energy.
Tesla was convinced that if he could tap the resonance energy of the Earth, that he would be able to create waves that would, in theory, never dissipate.
He initially reached out to J.P. Morgan Jr.
Damn it, Tesla. Please. Wireless electricity for the world, and all one needs is a cheap little device to receive it. How do you charge people for that? There's no goddamn profit in it, you vainglorious idiot.
At a time when war clouds were once again forming above Europe. I have made recent discoveries of inestimable value. The flying machine has completely demoralized the world, so much that in some cities, as London and Paris, people are in mortal fear from aerial bombing. The new means I have perfected afford absolute protection against this and other forms of attack. Nonetheless, Morgan was unconvinced of Tesla's idea. He then tried to persuade Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain. His proposal was diligently considered, but upon Chamberlain's resignation after Hitler had outmaneuvered him at Munich, the interest shown toward this anti-war weapon had plunged. After several failed attempts to raise awareness of his superweapon and its capabilities, Tesla published a treatise in 1937 called The Art of Projecting Concentrated Non-Dispersive Energy Through the Natural Media. The thesis offered viable technicalities about this all-powerful invention that, as Tesla claimed, would put an end to all war. The original document is preserved to this day inside the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade. After this move, Tesla had caught the attention of the Russians, who expressed a great deal of interest toward his invention. So, during the same year, Nikola Tesla had presented a more elaborate version of his plan to the Armtorg Trading Corporation, an alleged Soviet arms front in New York City. In 1939, the year the Second World War had begun, the first stage of this superweapons prototype was successfully tested in the USSR. To honor the agreement, Tesla received a check for $25,000 that would further allow him to fund his research. Of course, Tesla had passed from this existence 4 years later, without seeing some of his most intriguing inventions being used on a large scale.
There are some theories that suggest that Tesla might have been killed over his invention of the particle weapon. And certainly there are a lot of people who suggest that Tesla's papers and notes for a particle beam weapon were stolen so that nefarious governments could work on them.
So when he passed away, he took his secrets to the afterlife. However, the Russians, who had previously bought some of his blueprints, as well as the U.S., who had extracted through the FBI whatever work Tesla kept in his Colorado Springs laboratory, had cracked most of his riddles as time progressed and have managed to weaponize the Tesla scalar wave effects. After the atrocities of 2 world wars, and with an ever-expanding technological advancement, world leaders have started considering ways in which they could limit or put an end to global conflicts. In 1975, during the SALT talks, Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the Soviet Union at the time, had stressed that the development of new war weapons should be drastically limited because they have already become more frightening than the mind of man had imagined.
The German government took death rays very seriously.
The Nazis probably would have been interested in the particle beam weapon as one of several devices that they could use to terrorize another population.
The U.S. was engaged in fighting Hitler and the Nazis and trying to take over the world. So a weapon such as a death ray being developed by Tesla, falling into the wrong hands, could have been devastating.
Needless to say, most of the weapons in cause pertain to Tesla. His superweapon, dubbed Teleforce, was fully operational under the Soviet Union as early as the 70s. Now called the Seryshagin howitzer, the humongous Tesla scalar interferometer was exactly as Tesla had described it. It encompasses 4 modes of operation. The first one is the Tesla shield. It runs continuously and generates a thin, impenetrable hemispherical wall of energy over a selected area. It has defensive purposes and works as follows. By interfering 2 Fourier expansions and 3-dimensional scalar hemispherical patterns in space, they join into a dome-like shield of electromagnetic energy. Air molecules and atoms trapped inside are fully ionized, displaying an intense and vivid light. Any physical object that attempts to pass through this shield will receive a considerable discharge of electrical energy and will be vaporized in an instant. By stacking these energetic shells, they will deter any gamma radiation or EMPs coming its way. The second mode is more offensive. Utilizing 2 truncated Fourier transformers, the device shoots a 3-dimensional scalar 5-field pulse. A second pulse is then released, traveling at a faster velocity and overtaking the first one, merging into a deadly EMP of electromagnetic energy. The third mode is the same pulse variation ran continuously. Thus, 2 continuous scalar waves are sent forward, merging into vector energy at their target destination. According to some researchers, this is the exact way in which Tesla planned to transmit wireless energy, and also the weapon would annihilate hundreds of aircrafts and entire armies. The final mode, dubbed Time Squeeze, will let the user play with things like anti-gravity, dematerialization and materialization, transmutation, and it provides a great deal of medical benefits. Other effects may include subliminal and superliminal communication, seeing through Earth and the ocean, as well as reaching higher orders of reality. This is apparently possible because the human being has, between his ears, a Tesla scalar interferometer. This tiny biological device accounts for most parapsychological phenomena. It can also be triggered naturally through practice and meditation.
Today, if you were to look at one of those satellite images that shows you how the world is lit up at night, 95% of the electricity that you see in that picture, all of those lights, is distributed by alternating current. And one night he realized that he was not only getting currents through the earth, but he was also getting a consistent signal. First 1 beep, then 2 beeps, and 3 beeps as he listened on a telephone receiver.
The public was fascinated by this account because it made the headlines in major newspapers around the world that somehow Tesla was in communication with outer space.
Without Tesla's invention of alternating current technology, it would be a much darker and quieter world.
The technology behind Tesla's weapons is nothing new to modern man. They fall in the category of directed energy weapons, or DEWs, which are long-range weapon systems that inflict damage at a selected target by emitting powerful, focused bursts of energy. These emissions are either laser, microwaves, or particle beams. With such weapons at the disposal of world powers, it's easy to understand why another world war hasn't broken out by now. With his daring plan to arm all nations with this superweapon, it appears that Nikola Tesla has reached one of his end goals of establishing long-lasting peace between nations. Now, we can only wait and see when the world governments will release Tesla's ultimate secret of free energy.
People are asking questions about UFOs and ETs and hidden technology. And I'd like to ask you, Bob, and then you, Jeremy, about secrecy in general. Bob, you were upset back then when we first talked about the excessive secrecy, not only because it made for an unpleasant place to work, despite the fact that you were involved with this amazing technology, but also that you felt, in essence, the public deserved to know what was going on, that we had made contact at some level with this other intelligence from somewhere else. Talk to me about that and whether you still feel the same way. And I ask it in this context, is that a lot of people think you made this stuff up because you were working with your employers, either wittingly or unwittingly, and that you made it up to distract attention from something else that was out there at Groom Lake. Talk about secrecy and that idea.
I've heard that scenario a lot of times, and I mean, to me, that's ridiculous. Really, what else is out there? You know, there's advanced aircraft and technology at Groom Lake, but it's nothing like what's at S4. That's why they made a separate facility for it. So I'm really going to have to push that aside because I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. Concerning secrecy, there's really two avenues of thought there, because you have to look at the weapon potential of this technology, and it's impressive. Because really, if you have a handle on this technology, you literally control the world, hands down. There's no defending against it. I mean, you win, period. So, and that means an awful lot to the military. Even if you don't have a handle on it, just the fact, you have the technology and the chance to research it and try to see if you can duplicate it, which is what our job was, that's a big, big deal. So, yeah, are you going to keep that secret? You pretty much have to. It's not a safe world. And considering what's going on with China and Russia, all the more so now. So, yeah, even I would keep, the technology secret. But you really have to look at the other side of the equation, that, there has already been contact and we have artifacts from another civilization. I mean, we know there is other intelligent life out there. So there has to be, and maybe they just couldn't find a way to make a happy median of keeping, you know, half of it secret and just letting everyone else know, you know, what had happened. That you know, we really do know that there is life elsewhere. So I don't know. It's difficult. I don't know how you would really separate the two, but I can see both sides of the coin myself.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
High oil prices helped ExxonMobil boost its profits to nearly $11 billion in the latest quarter.
Shell is the latest oil company to report a big rise in profits thanks to higher oil prices.
The ability of speculators to profit is surely dwarfed by the ability of oil-producing nations to profit from a higher price of oil.
Maybe the easiest way for these guys to make the money, manipulate oil back above $50, even $60.
Oil. From farm to pharmaceutical, diesel truck to dinner plate, pipeline to plastic product, it is impossible to think of an area of our modern-day lives that is not affected by the petrochemical industry. The story of oil is the story of the modern world. Parts of that story are well known. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, the internal combustion engine and the transformation of global transport, the House of Saud and the oil wars in the Middle East. Other parts are more obscure. The quest for oil in the outbreak of World War I, the petrochemical interests behind modern medicine, the big oil money behind the Green Revolution and the Gene Revolution. But that story, properly told, begins somewhere unexpected. Not in Pennsylvania with the first commercial drilling operation and the first oil boom, but in the rural backwoods of early 19th century New York State. And it doesn't start with crude oil or its derivatives, but a different product altogether. Snake oil. Dr. Bill Livingston, celebrated cancer specialist, was the very image of the traveling snake oil salesman. He was neither a doctor nor a cancer specialist. His real name was not even Livingston. More to the point, the rock oil tonic he pawned was a useless mixture of laxative and petroleum and had no effect whatsoever on the cancer of the poor townsfolk he conned into buying it. He lived the life of a vagabond, always on the run from the last group of people he had fooled, engaged in ever more outrageous deceptions to make sure that the past wouldn't catch up with him. He abandoned his first wife and their 6 children to start a bigamous marriage in Canada at the same time as he fathered 2 more children by a 3rd woman. He adopted the name Livingston after he was indicted for raping a girl in Cayuga in 1849. When he wasn't running away from them or disappearing for years at a time, he would teach his children the tricks of his treacherous trade. He once bragged of his parenting technique. "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp." A towering man of over 6 feet and with natural good looks that he used to his advantage, he went by Big Bill. Others, less generously, called him Devil Bill. But his real name was William Avery Rockefeller, and it was his son, John D. Rockefeller, who would go on to found the Standard Oil monopoly and become the world's first billionaire. The world we live in today is the world created in Devil Bill's image. It's a world founded on treachery, deceit, and the naivety of a public that has never wised up to the parlor tricks that the Rockefellers and their ilk have been using to shape the world for the past century and a half. This is the story of the oligarchy. Titusville, 1857. A most unlikely man alights from a railway car into the midst of this sleepy western Pennsylvania town on the shores of Oil Creek. Colonel Edwin Drake. He's from the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company, and he's here on a mission to collect oil. Like Dr. Bill, Drake isn't really a colonel. The title is bestowed on him by George Bissell and James Townsend, a lawyer and a banker who started the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company after they discovered they could distill the region's naturally occurring Seneca oil into lamp oil or kerosene. Drake is actually an unemployed railroad conductor who talked himself into a job after staying at the same hotel as Bissell the year before. Calling him a colonel, it is hoped, will help win the respect of the locals. The locals think he's crazy anyway. Seneca oil is indeed plentiful, bubbling out of seeps and collecting in the creek, but other than as a cure-all medicine or grease for the local sawmill's machinery, it's hardly seen as something valuable. In fact, it can be a downright nuisance, contaminating brine wells that supply Pittsburgh's booming salt industry. Still, Drake has a task to complete: finding a way to collect enough oil to make the distillation of Seneca oil into lamp oil profitable. He tries everything he can think of. The Native Americans had historically collected the oil by damming the creek near a seep and skimming the oil off the top. But Drake can only collect 6 to 10 gallons of oil a day this way, even when he opens up extra seeps. He tries digging a shaft, but the groundwater floods in too quickly. By the summer of 1859, he's desperate. Drake is running out of ideas, Bissell and Townsend are running out of patience, and, most importantly, the company is running out of funds. He turns to Uncle Billy Smith, a Pittsburgh blacksmith who had experience drilling brine wells with steam-powered equipment. They get to work drilling down through the shale bedrock to reach the oil. It's maddeningly slow work, with the crude equipment struggling to get through 3 feet of bedrock a day. By August 27th, they've drilled down 69.5 feet. Drake has used the last of his funds, and Bissell and his partners have decided to close up the operation. On August 28th, they strike oil.
Then on Sunday, August 28, 1859, oil bubbled up the drive pipe. Uncle Billy and his son Sam bailed out several buckets of oil. On Monday, the very day that Colonel Drake received his final payment and an order to close down the operation, they hitched the walking beam to a water pump, and the oil began to flow. The first oil was to sell for $40 a barrel. Years later, a local newspaper interviewed Uncle Billy about the day they struck oil.
I commenced drilling, and at 4 o'clock I struck the oil. I says to Mr. Drake, "Look there, what do you think of this?" He looked down the pipe and said, "What's that?" I said, "That is your fortune."
Drake's well proved that by drilling for it, oil could be found in abundance and produced cheaply. Overnight, a whole new industry was born. Before long, in millions of homes, farms, and factories around the world, lamps would be lit with kerosene, refined from West Pennsylvania crude.
When the word came out that Drake had struck oil, the cry went up throughout the narrow valleys of western Pennsylvania. The crazy Yankee has struck oil, the crazy Yankee has struck oil. And it was the first great boom. It was like a gold rush.
Down in Pennsylvania, there is plenty oil, they say. Petroleum, petroleum, we must all have some.
Overnight, the quiet farming backwoods of rural Pennsylvania was transformed into a bustling oil region, with prospectors leasing up flats, towns springing up from nowhere, and a forest of percussion rigs covering the land. The first oil boom had arrived. Already poised to make the most of this boom was a young up-and-coming bookkeeper in Cleveland with a head for numbers, John Davison Rockefeller. He had 2 ambitions in life: to make $100,000 and to live to be 100 years old. John D. set off to make his fortune in the late 1850s, armed with a $1,000 loan from his father, Devil Bill.
Grandfather never finished high school and went to Cleveland, having borrowed $1,000 from his father to start a business, paid 9% interest on it, incidentally. And he read about the oil business just beginning and got interested and came to realize that it was a very volatile business at the time.
In 1863, seeing the oil boom and sensing the profits to be made in the fledgling business, Rockefeller formed a partnership with fellow businessmen Maurice B. Clark and Samuel Andrews, a chemist who had built an oil refinery but knew little about the business of getting his product to market. 2 years later, the shrewd John D. bought out his partners for $72,500 and, with Andrews as partner, launched Rockefeller and Andrews. By 1870, after 5 years of strategic partnerships and mergers, Rockefeller had incorporated Standard Oil. The story of the rise of Standard Oil is an oft-told one.
In a move that would transform the American economy, Rockefeller set out to replace a world of independent oilmen with a giant company controlled by him. In 1870, begging bankers for more loans, he formed Standard Oil of Ohio. The next year, he quietly put what he called Our Plan, his campaign to dominate the volatile oil industry, into devastating effect. Rockefeller knew that the refiner with the lowest transportation cost could bring rivals to their knees. He entered into a secret alliance with the railroads called the South Improvement Company. In exchange for large, regular shipments, Rockefeller and his allies secured transport rates far lower than those of their bewildered competitors.
By 1879, when Rockefeller is 40, he controls 90% of the oil refining in the world. Within a few years, he will control 90% of the marketing of oil and a third of all of the oil wells. So this very young man controls what is not only a national but an international monopoly in a commodity that is about to become the most important strategic commodity in the world economy.
By the 1880s, the American oil industry was the Standard Oil Company, and Standard Oil was John D. Rockefeller. But it wasn't long until a handful of similarly ambitious and well-connected families began to emulate the Standard Oil success story in other parts of the globe. One such competitor emerged from the Caucasus in the 1870s, where Imperial Russia had opened up the vast Caspian Sea oil deposits to private development. Two families quickly combined forces to take advantage of the opportunity. The Nobels, led by Ludwig Nobel and including his dynamite-inventing, prize-creating brother Alfred, and the French branch of the infamous Rothschild banking dynasty, led by Alphonse Rothschild. In 1891, the Rothschilds contracted with M. Samuel & Co., a Far East shipping company headquartered in London and run by Marcus Samuel, to do what had never been done before: ship their Nobel-supplied Caspian oil through the Suez Canal to East Asian markets. The project was immense. It involved not only sophisticated engineering to construct the first oil tankers to be approved by the Suez Canal Company, but the strictest secrecy. If word of the endeavor was to get back to Rockefeller through his international intelligence network, it would risk bringing the wrath of Standard Oil, which could afford to cut rates and squeeze them out of the market. In the end, they succeeded, and the first bulk tanker, the Murex, sailed through the Suez Canal in 1892 en route to Thailand. In 1897, M. Samuel & Co. became the Shell Transport and Trading Company. Realizing that reliance on the Rothschild Nobel Caspian oil left the company vulnerable to supply shocks, Shell began to look to the Far East for other sources of oil. In Borneo, they ran up against Royal Dutch Petroleum, established in The Hague in 1890 with the support of King William III of the Netherlands, to develop oil deposits in the Dutch East Indies. The two companies, fearing competition from Standard Oil, merged in 1903 into the Asiatic Petroleum Company, jointly owned with the French Rothschilds, and in 1907 became Royal Dutch Shell. Another global competitor to the Standard Oil throne emerged in Iran at the turn of the 20th century. In 1901, millionaire socialite William Knox D'Arcy negotiated an incredible concession with the King of Persia: exclusive rights to prospect for oil throughout most of the country for 60 years. After 7 years of fruitless search, D'Arcy and his Glasgow-based partner, Burma Oil, were ready to abandon the country altogether. In early May of 1908, they sent a telegram to their geologist telling him to dismiss his staff, dismantle his equipment, and come back home. He defied the order, and weeks later struck oil. Burma Oil promptly spun off the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to oversee production of Persian oil. The British government took 51% majority control of the company's shares in 1914 at the behest of Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, and survives today as BP. The Rothschilds and Nobels, the Dutch royal family, the Rockefellers. These early titans of the oil industry and their corporate shells pioneered a new model for amassing and expanding fortunes hitherto unheard of. They were the scions of a new oligarchy, one built around oil and its control, from wellhead to pump. But it was not just about money. The monopolization of this, the key energy resource of the 20th century, helped secure the oligarchs not just wealth, but power over the lives of billions. Billions who came to depend on black gold for the provision of just about every aspect of their daily lives. In the late 19th century, however, it was by no means certain that oil would become the key resource of the 20th century. As cheap illumination from the newly commercialized light bulb began to destroy the market for lamp oil, the oligarchs were on the verge of losing the value from their monopoly. But a series of lucky strikes was about to catapult their fortunes even further. The very next year after the commercial introduction of the light bulb, another invention came along to save the oil industry. German engineer Carl Benz patented a reliable two-stroke internal combustion engine. The engine ran on gasoline, another petroleum byproduct, and became the basis for the Benz motor wagon that, in 1888, became the first commercially available automobile in history. And with that stroke of luck, the business that Rockefeller and the other oligarchs had spent decades consolidating was saved. But more luck was needed to ensure the market for this new engine. In the early days of the automobile era, it was by no means certain that gas-powered cars would come to dominate the market. Working models of electric vehicles had been around since the 1830s, and the first electric car was built in 1884. By 1897, there was a fleet of all-electric taxis shuttling passengers around London. The world land speed record was set by an electric car in 1898. By the dawn of the 20th century, electric cars accounted for 28% of the automobiles in the United States. The electrics had advantages over the internal combustion engine. They required no gear shifting or hand cranking, and had none of the vibration, smell, or noise associated with gasoline-powered cars. Lady Luck intervened again on January 10, 1901, when prospectors struck oil at Spindletop in East Texas. The gusher blew 100,000 barrels a day and set off the next great oil boom, providing cheap, plentiful oil to the American market and driving down gas prices. It wasn't long before the expensive, low-range electric engines were abandoned altogether, and big, loud, gas-guzzling engines came to dominate the road, all fueled by the black gold that Standard Oil, Shell, Gulf, Texaco, Anglo-Persian, and the other oil majors of the time were drilling, refining, and selling. Perhaps John D's greatest stroke of luck, however, was not supposed to be luck at all. Rockefeller had come under increasing scrutiny by a public outraged by the unprecedented wealth he had amassed through Standard Oil. Muckraking reporters like Ida Tarbell began digging up the dirt on his rise to power through railroad conspiracies, secret deals with competitors, and other shady practices. The press pictured him as a colossus with bribed politicians literally in the palm of his hand. Standard Oil was a menacing octopus with its tentacles strangling the lifeblood of the nation. Hearings began, investigations were launched, lawsuits were brought against him, and then, finally, in 1911, the Supreme Court made a monumental decision.
On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States declared that Standard Oil was a monopoly in restraint of trade and should be dissolved. Rockefeller heard of the decision while golfing at Kankakee with a priest from the local Catholic Church, Father J.P. Lennon.
And Rockefeller reacted with amazing aplomb. He turned to the Catholic priest and said, "Father Lennon, have you some money?" And the priest was very startled by the question and said, "No." And then he said, "Why?" And Rockefeller replied, "Buy Standard Oil."
As Rockefeller foresaw, the individual Standard Oil companies were worth more than the single corporation. In the next few years, their shares doubled and tripled in value. By the time the reign of cash was over, Rockefeller had the greatest personal fortune in history, nearly 2% of the American economy.
And it was really losing the antitrust case that converted John D. Rockefeller into history's first billionaire. So that Standard Oil was punished in the federal antitrust case, but John D. Rockefeller Sr. most assuredly was not.
To the amazement of the world, Rockefeller's punishment had in fact been his reward. Rather than being taken down a peg, The splitting up of the Standard Oil monopoly had launched him as the world's only acknowledged billionaire at a time when the average annual income in America was $520. Rockefeller's story was perfectly mirrored by the story of Colonel Edwin Drake. Having struck oil in Titusville and given rise to a billion-dollar global industry, Drake had not had the foresight to patent his drilling technique or even to buy up the land around his own well. He ended up in poverty, relying on an annuity from the state of Pennsylvania to scrape together a living, and dying in 1880. For the oligarchy, the lesson of the rise of Rockefeller was obvious. The more ruthlessly that monopoly was pursued, the tighter that control was grasped, the greater the lust for power and money, the greater the reward would be in the end. From now on, no invention would derail the oil majors from their quest for total control. No competition would be tolerated. No threat to the oligarchs would be allowed to rise. When asked how he could justify the treachery and deceit with which he had pursued the creation of the Standard Oil monopoly, John D. Rockefeller is reputed to have said, "Competition is a sin." This is the mentality of the monopolist, and it is this justification, framed as religious conviction, that drove the oligarchs to so ruthlessly eliminate anyone who would dare rise up as a pretender to their throne. Ironically, it was the competition between the oligarchs in the early 20th century that helped give rise to an early external threat to their empire: alcohol fuel. As historian Lyle Cummins has noted of the period, the oil trust battles between Rockefeller, the Rothschilds, the Nobels, and Marcus Samuel's Shell kept prices in a state of flux, and engines often had to be adaptable to the fuel that was available. In many areas where oil wasn't available, the alternative was alcohol. Ethyl alcohol had been used as fuel for lamps and engines since the early 19th century. Although it was generally more expensive, alcohol fuel offered a stability of supply that was alluring, especially in areas like London or Paris that did not have predictable access to oil supplies. Alcohol has a lower heat value, or BTU, than gasoline, but a series of tests by the U.S. Geological Survey and the U.S. Navy in 1907 and 1908 proved that the higher compression ratio of alcohol engines could perfectly offset the lower heat value, thus making alcohol and gasoline engines fuel economy equivalent. One early supporter of alcohol fuel was Henry Ford, who designed his Model T to run on either alcohol or gasoline. Sensing an opportunity for new markets to boost the independent American farms that he felt were vital to the nation, Henry Ford told the New York Times, "The fuel of the future is going to come from fruit like that sumac out by the road, or from apples, weeds, sawdust, almost anything. There is fuel in every bit of vegetable matter that can be fermented." Farmers, looking to capitalize on this, lobbied for the repeal of a $2.08 per gallon alcohol tax that had been imposed to help pay for the Civil War. They were aided by those who saw fuel alcohol as a way to break the oligarchs' monopoly. In support of a bill to repeal the alcohol tax, President Teddy Roosevelt told the U.S. Congress in 1906, "The Standard Oil Company has, largely by unfair or unlawful methods, crushed out home competition. It is highly desirable that an element of competition should be introduced by the passage of some such law as that which has already passed the House, putting alcohol used in the arts and manufactures upon the free list." The alcohol tax was repealed in 1906, and for a time corn ethanol at 14 cents a gallon was cheaper than gasoline at 22 cents a gallon. The promise of cheap, unpatentable, unmonopolizable fuel production open to anyone with raw vegetable matter and a still, swept the nation. But cheap, plentiful fuel that can be grown and produced locally and independently is not what the oligarchs had in mind. A 1909 USGS report comparing gas and alcohol engines had noted that a significant point in alcohol fuel's favor was that there were fewer restrictions on alcohol engines. For the oligarchs, the answer was simple: find a way to place greater restrictions on alcohol engines. Thankfully for them, the answer to their problem was already gaining popular support. In the 19th century, America had a drinking problem. By 1830, the average American over 15 years old drank 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year, 3 times higher than today's average. This led to the first anti-alcohol movements in the 1830s and 1840s, and the formation of the Prohibition Party in 1869, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the 1870s. The movement enjoyed widespread and growing support, but had few political successes. Maine flirted with prohibition by outlawing the sale and manufacture of liquor in 1851, but the ban only lasted 5 years. This changed with the formation of the Anti-Saloon League in Standard Oil's birth state of Ohio in 1893. The ASL was started by John D. Rockefeller's longtime personal friend Howard Hyde Russell, and was bankrolled in part by generous annual donations from Rockefeller himself. The ASL, with Rockefeller's backing, quickly became the driving force behind a national movement to outlaw the production and sale of alcohol. Rockefeller was a teetotaler himself, not from moral concern, but because he was afraid that good cheer among friends would lead to his downfall in business. Stephen Harkness, one of the silent partner investors in Standard Oil and a director in the company until his death, had caught Rockefeller's eye when he made a fortune buying up whiskey in advance of a new excise tax that he had been tipped about, and selling it at a huge profit after the tax kicked in. No, Rockefeller and Standard Oil were not concerned about the moral state of the nation, except as far as it impacted their bottom line. But when Prohibition did come in 1920, it had an interesting side effect. Although it didn't ban the use of ethanol as a fuel directly, it did lead to increasingly burdensome restrictions, requiring producers to add petroleum products to their ethanol to make it poisonous before it could be sold. Alcohol fuel, now completely unable to compete with gasoline, was abandoned altogether by the automobile industry. Another existential threat to the vast fortunes of the early oligarchs was to require an even greater effort at social engineering: public transportation. By the end of World War I, private car ownership was still a relative rarity. Only 1 in 10 Americans owned a car. Rail was still the transportation of choice for the vast majority of the public, and city dwellers in most major cities relied on electric trolley networks to transport them around town. In 1936, General Motors formed a front company, National City Lines, along with Firestone Tire and Standard Oil of California, to implement a process of bustitution, scrapping streetcars and tearing up railways to replace them with GM's own buses running on Standard Oil-supplied diesel. The plan was remarkably successful. As historian and researcher F. William Engdahl notes in Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars, by the end of the 1940s, GM had bought and scrapped over 100 municipal electric transit systems in 45 cities and put gas-burning GM buses on the streets in their place. By 1955, almost 90% of the electric streetcar lines in the United States had been ripped out or otherwise eliminated. The cartel had been careful to hide their involvement in National City Lines, but it was revealed to the public in 1946 by an enterprising retired naval lieutenant commander, Edwin J. Quimby. He wrote a manifesto exposing what he called a careful, deliberately planned campaign to swindle you out of your most important and valuable public utilities, your electric railway system. He uncovered the oligarchs' stock ownership of National City Lines and its subsidiaries, and detailed how they had step-by-step bought up and destroyed the public transportation lines in Baltimore, Los Angeles, St. Louis, and other major urban centers. Quimby's warning caught the attention of federal prosecutors, and in 1947, National City Lines was indicted for conspiring to form a transportation monopoly and conspiring to monopolize sales of buses and supplies. In 1949, GM, Firestone, Standard Oil of California, and their officers and corporate associates were convicted on the second count of conspiracy. The punishment for buying up and dismantling America's public transportation infrastructure? A $5,000 fine. H.C. Grossman, who had been the director of Pacific City Lines when it oversaw the scrapping of Los Angeles' $100 million Pacific Electric system, was fined exactly $1. Unsurprisingly, GM and its associates did not remain in the doghouse for long. In 1953, President Eisenhower appointed Charles Wilson, then the president of General Motors, as Secretary of Defense. Wilson, with Francis DuPont of the Rockefeller-connected DuPont family as chief administrator of federal highways, oversaw one of the largest public works projects in American history, the creation of the interstate highway system. With a war-era excise tax on train tickets still in place, and federally funded highways and airports providing cheaper alternatives, rail travel declined a startling 84% between 1945 and 1964. This social engineering paid off well for Standard Oil and its growing list of petrochemical associates. In the 2.5 decades after the outbreak of World War II, vehicle production in Detroit almost tripled, from 4.5 million cars a year in 1940 to over 11 million in 1965. As a result, sales of refined gasoline over the same period rose 300%. But Rockefeller was not the only oligarch working to crush all opposition to his monopoly. Across the pond, the European oligarchs were working to protect their own oil investments from upstart competitors. In 1889, a consortium of German investors led by Siemens Deutsche Bank obtained a concession from the Turkish government for extension of a railway line connecting Berlin to Basra on the Persian Gulf via Baghdad in what was then part of the Ottoman Empire. The Berlin-Baghdad railway concession was for 99 years and came with mineral rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the line, an especially lucrative deal since the rail cut right through the heart of the still untapped Mesopotamian oil region south of Mosul along the Tigris River. For the powers behind the British Empire, concerned with the military rise of Germany, this deal was unacceptable.
Well, Germany, in the end of the 19th century, was looking for outlets for its exports, its industrial exports, as the German economy was growing like China is growing in the last 30 years. And they decided that Turkey would be an ideal strategic trade partner for Germany. And Georg von Siemens, one of the directors of Deutsche Bank, came up with a strategy to extend a railway from Berlin all the way down to Baghdad, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire, Baghdad in Iraq today, near the Persian Gulf. And German military began training the Turkish military. The German industry began investing in Turkey. They saw a huge potential market to begin bringing Turkey into the 20th century economically. Well, Deutsche Bank also negotiated mineral rights. I think it was 20 kilometers on either side of the railway. And it was already known in 1914 that Mosul and these other areas contained huge petroleum deposits. Well, why is that significant? At the end of the century, 19th century, Jack Fisher, the Lord of the Admiralty and the head of the Royal Navy, advocated the conversion of the British Navy from coal-fired to oil-fired, that it would have a qualitative strategic improvement in their every aspect of warship design. And since Britain didn't know that they had any oil back then, they went to Persia and swindled the Shah at that time out of oil rights in Persia. They went to Kuwait and backed a coup d'etat of the Al-Sabah family to be a British pawn. And they literally wrote a contract with him that nothing that Kuwait does with the outside world will be done without approval of the British governor. And Kuwait was known to have oil and lying right on the Persian Gulf. Well, the British looked at this railway plan of the Germans going right down to Baghdad and said, my God, you can put soldiers on rail cars and bring them down and threaten the oil lifeline of the British Navy. This is a strategic move by the Germans. It also would make Germany independent of the British control of the seas.
The British oligarchs, including the British Crown with its hidden controlling stake in Anglo-Persian oil and the Rothschilds merchant Marcus Samuel at Royal Dutch Shell, sought to counter this German threat to their commercial and strategic interests. They used Armenian-born, naturalized British citizen Calouste Gulbenkian, the architect of the Royal Dutch Shell merger, in order, as he later recalled, to see British influence get the upper hand in Turkey against the Germans. If that was his task, it was a remarkable success. In 1909, the British set up the Turkish National Bank, which was Turkish in name only. Founded by London banker Sir Edward Castle and with directors like Hugo Baring of the Barings banking family, Castle himself, and Gulbenkian, the bank set up the Turkish Petroleum Company in 1912. Formed explicitly to exploit the petroleum-rich oil fields of Iraq, then part of the Ottoman Empire, Gulbenkian brokered a deal that forced Deutsche Bank, with its 40-kilometer concessions along the oil-rich Baghdad railway line, into a junior partnership in the company. The stock was split so the British government's Anglo-Persian Oil Company owned half the shares, with Royal Dutch Shell and Deutsche Bank splitting the other half. Their plan to take over Germany's Turkish oil interests had been successful, but in an amazing irony, it didn't even matter. Gulbenkian finished negotiations for the Iraqi oil concession on June 28, 1914, the same day Archduke Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo. An alliance the British had been brokering for years to constrain the rising German threat, an alliance involving France and Russia, kicked into motion, and the world was engulfed in war. By the end of World War I, the British and their allies had taken over Iraq and its oil deposits anyway. Germany had been completely cut out, and Gulbenkian, their scheming servant, received 5% of all oil field proceeds in the newly minted country. As the century wore on, the oil industry grew beyond the control of the handful of families that had dominated it since its inception. Oil deposits were located around the globe, and the resources of entire nation-states were marshaled to control them. Now, threats to the oligarchs and their interests required multilateral, multinational responses, and the consequences of those deals were felt worldwide. The story of the oil shock of 1973, as it has been delivered to us by the history books, is well known.
By the late 1960s, the nation relied on imported oil to keep the economy strong. Then, in the early 1970s, oil-dependent America's nightmares came true. 13 oil-producing countries in the Middle East and South America formed OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In 1973, OPEC placed an oil embargo on the U.S. and other nations that had supported Israel against the Arab states in the Yom Kippur War. The American economy went into a tailspin as gas shortages gripped the nation.
Few, however, know that the crisis and its ensuing response was in fact prepared months ahead of time at a secret meeting in Sweden in 1973. The meeting was the annual gathering of the Bilderberg Group, a secretive cabal formed by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands in 1954. The Dutch royal family not only gave its royal imprint to Royal Dutch Petroleum, they are still rumored to be, along with the Rothschilds, one of the largest shareholders in Royal Dutch Shell, from the days when Queen Wilhelmina's Anglo-Dutch petroleum holdings and other investments made her the world's first female billionaire, right through to today. Bernhard's guest list at the Bilderberg Group reflected his position in the oligarchy. Alongside him at the Swedish conference were David Rockefeller of the Standard Oil dynasty and his protege Henry Kissinger, Baron Edmund de Rothschild, E.G. Collado, the vice president of Exxon, Sir Dennis Greenhill, director of British Petroleum, and Garrett A. Wagner, president of Bernhard's own Royal Dutch Shell. At the meeting in Sweden, held 5 months before the oil crisis began, the oligarchs and their political and business allies were planning their response to a monetary crisis that threatened the world dominance of the US dollar. Under the Bretton Woods system, negotiated in the final days of World War II, the US dollar would be the backbone of the world monetary system, convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, with all other currencies pegged to it. Increasing US expenditures in Vietnam and decreasing exports caused Germany, France, and other nations to start demanding gold for their dollars. With the Federal Reserve's official gold holdings plunging and unable to stem the tide of demand, Nixon abandoned Bretton Woods in August 1971, threatening the dollar's position as the world reserve currency.
Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
As leaked documents from the 1973 Bilderberg meeting show, the oligarchs decided to use their control over the flow of oil to save the American hegemon. Acknowledging that OPEC could completely disorganize and undermine the world monetary system, the Bilderberg attendees prepared for an energy crisis or an increase in energy costs, which, they predicted, could mean an oil price between $10 and $12, a staggering 400% increase from the current price of $3.01 per barrel. 5 months later, Bilderberg attendee and Rockefeller protege Henry Kissinger, acting as Nixon's Secretary of State, engineered the Yom Kippur War and provoked OPEC's response, an oil embargo of the U.S. and other nations that had supported Israel. On October 16, 1973, OPEC raised oil prices by 70%. At their December meeting, the Shah of Iran demanded and received a further raise to $11.65 a barrel, or 400% of oil's pre-crisis price. When asked by Saudi King Faisal's personal emissary why he had demanded such a bold price increase, he replied, "Tell your king, if he wants the answer to this question, he should go to Washington and ask Henry Kissinger." In the second move of the operation, Kissinger helped negotiate a deal with Saudi Arabia. In exchange for U.S. arms and military protection, the Saudis would price all their future oil sales in dollars and recycle those dollars through treasury purchases via Wall Street banks. The deal was a bonanza for the oligarchs. Not only did they get to pass the price increases on to the consumers, but they benefited from the huge flows of money into their own banks. The Shah of Iran parked the National Iranian Oil Company's revenues in Rockefeller's own Chase Bank, revenues that reached $14 billion per year in the wake of the oil crisis. With the creation of this new system, the petrodollar, the oligarchs had reached unprecedented levels of control over the economy. Not only that, they had backed the world monetary system with their commodity, oil, and brought potential competition from upstart producer nations under their control all in one step. But for the insatiable appetites of these monopolist titans, mere control over the world's monetary system was not enough. In the 19th century, railroad conspiracies and predatory pricing had been enough to assure the oligarchs' monopoly. But by the time that the British Crown, the Dutch royal family, the Rothschilds, and the other European oligarchs began opening up the Middle East and the Far East to oil exploration in the early 20th century, the goal was no longer to maximize profits or control the oil industry. It was not even to control international diplomacy. It was to control and shape the world itself, its resources, its environment, and its people. In order to achieve this goal, the oligarchy would need a facelift. In the current age, with the Rockefeller name now more likely to be associated with Rockefeller Plaza or Rockefeller University than Standard Oil, it is difficult to understand just how hated John D. was in his own day. He was the head of the Standard Oil Hydra, an octopus strangling the world in his tentacles, a cutthroat gardener pruning the competitors from the flower of his oil monopoly. As one of the richest men the world had ever known, he was an easy target for the average working man's frustration and a magnet for the poor seeking help.
He received on average 50 to 60,000 letters a month asking for help. Dozens of people followed him in the street. Literally, crowds stood around the Standard Oil offices, waiting for him to come out. Little children, painfully thin, crying in the street and so on. Rockefeller felt overwhelmed.
Besieged by the downtrodden, despised by the working man, hounded by Ida Tarbell and the muckraking press, John D. had the mother of all PR problems. The answer was simple: invent the PR industry. He hired Ivy Ledbetter Lee, a journalist turned communications expert who invented the modern public relations industry, to burnish the Rockefellers' tarnished image. It was Lee that suggested giving the family name to Rockefeller Center and filming John D. handing out dimes in public.
An early master of public relations, Lee used the media which the muckrakers had used to disgrace Rockefeller to turn him into a sympathetic figure. Ivy Lee recognized early the power of the new moving picture and used newsreels to show a remarkably benevolent Rockefeller.
I am very grateful
to you and to a host of people who are so kind and good to me all the time.
Why? Because you're so good to everybody.
Yes, you are.
As Ivy Lee began to kind of control his public image, he became oddly a kind of American character. And people kind of warmed to him in a bizarre sort of way. It was like having Frankenstein on the loose walking around New York City or something like that with a cane and a long hat.
Although this plane never takes off, this photo opportunity was presented as Senior's first flight. Perhaps Ivy Lee's most brilliant public relations move was the casting of Rockefeller as the man who gave out dimes.
Don't you give a dime, Mr. Rockefeller? You had a dime.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I consider myself...
Thank you for the ride.
I consider myself more than amply paid.
Bless you, bless you,
Yes.
bless you.
These PR stunts seem obvious and ham-handed by today's standards, but they were effective enough. To this day, people leave dimes on the stone marker at the base of the 70-foot Egyptian obelisk that towers over John Dee's final resting place in Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery. But it was not stage-managed photo opportunities like these that transformed Rockefeller into a public hero. In order to win the public over, he was going to have to give them what they wanted. And what they wanted wasn't difficult to understand. Money. But just as his father, Devil Bill, had taught him to do in all his business dealings, Rockefeller made sure to get the better end of the bargain. He would donate his great wealth to the creation of public institutions, but those institutions would be used to bend society to his will. As every would-be ruler throughout history has realized, society has to be transformed from the ground up. Americans in the 19th century still prized education and intellectual pursuits, with the 1840 census finding unsurprisingly that the United States, a nation that had been mobilized by tracts like Thomas Paine's remarkably popular Common Sense, was a nation of readers with a remarkable 93% to 100% literacy rate. Before the first compulsory schooling laws in Massachusetts in 1852, education was private and decentralized, and as a result classical education, including study of Greek and Latin and a solid grounding in history and science, was widespread. But a nation of individuals who could think for themselves was anathema to the monopolists. The oligarchs needed a mass of obedient workers, an entire class of people whose intellect was developed just enough to prepare them for lives of drudgery in a factory. Into the midst stepped John D. Rockefeller with his first great act of public charity, the establishment of the University of Chicago. He was aided in this task by Frederick Taylor Gates, a Baptist minister that Rockefeller befriended in 1889 and who would go on to be John Dee's most trusted philanthropic advisor. Gates would go on to write a short tract, The Country School of Tomorrow, that laid out the Rockefeller plan for education. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and, unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers, or men of learning or science. We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. Although Rockefeller's resources weren't exactly limitless, they might as well have been. In 1902, he established the General Education Board to help implement Gates's vision for the Country School of Tomorrow with a staggering $180 million endowment. The Rockefeller influence on education was felt almost immediately, and it was amplified by help from fellow monopolists of the era who were approaching the topic of philanthropy from the same angle. Although best known as a steel magnate, Andrew Carnegie's fortune started on the railroads transporting Rockefeller's Standard Oil around the country, and was greatly magnified by a lucrative investment in property near Oil Creek that provided steady, profitable oil sales. In 1905, he established the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, a tax-free foundation through which Carnegie and his appointees could direct the development of the education system in the United States and, eventually, worldwide. In 1910, Rockefeller followed suit by establishing the Rockefeller Foundation, which became the tax-free umbrella organization for his philanthropic ambitions. As the Reese Committee, a congressional investigation into the activities of these tax-free foundations in the 1950s, discovered, it wasn't long before Carnegie's endowment approached Rockefeller's foundation with a proposal to cooperate on their shared desire to transform the American education system in their own image. Norman Dodd, the director of research for the congressional committee who was granted access to the Carnegie Endowment's board minutes, explains.
So they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration in the teaching of American history. So they approach 4 of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And then they approach the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber, will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assemble 20. And they take this 20 potential teachers of American history to London, and there they're briefed into what is expected of them when, as and if they secure appointments in keeping with the doctorates they will have earned. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency.
With this base for transformation firmly established, the Rockefeller Foundation and like-minded organizations embarked on a program so ambitious that it almost defies comprehension. They transformed the practice of medicine. As usual, the oligarchs that funded this change were also there to profit from it, and once again, John D. took his cue from Devil Bill's example. William Rockefeller had called his brand of snake oil Nujol for new oil, and Standard Oil spun off Nujol as a laxative under their Stanco subsidiary. Manufactured on the same premises as Flit, an insecticide also derived from Standard Oil's byproducts, Nujol sold at the druggist for 28 cents per 6-ounce bottle. It cost Standard Oil less than 1/5 of a cent to manufacture. Pharmaceuticals provided a lucrative new opportunity for the oligarchs, but in a turn-of-the-century America that was still largely based on naturopathic herbal remedies, it was a tough sell. The oligarchy went to work changing that. In 1901, John D. established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. The institute recruited Simon Flexner, a pathology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, to serve as its director. His brother, Abraham, was an educator who was contracted by the Carnegie Foundation to write a report on the state of the American medical education system. His study, the Flexner Report, along with the hundreds of millions of dollars that the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations were to shower on medical research in the coming years, resulted in a sweeping overhaul of the American medical system. Naturopathic and homeopathic medicine, medical care focused on unpatentable, unmarketable natural remedies and cures, was now dismissed as quackery. Only drug-based allopathic medicine requiring expensive medical procedures and lengthy hospital stays was to be taken seriously.
The fortunes of Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller financed surgery, radiation, and synthetic drugs. They were to become the economic foundations of the new medical economy.
The takeover of the medical industry was accomplished by the takeover of the medical schools. Well, the people that we're talking about, Rockefeller and Carnegie in particular, came to the picture and said, we will put up money. They offered tremendous amounts of money to the schools that would agree to cooperate with them. The donors said to the schools, we're giving you all this money. Now, would it be too much to ask if we could put some of our people on your board of directors to see that our money is being spent wisely? Almost overnight, all of the major universities received large grants from these sources and also accepted 1, 2, or 3 of these people that I mentioned on their board of directors, and the schools literally were taken over by the financial interests that put up the money. Now, what happened as a result of that is that the schools did receive an infusion of money. They were able to build new buildings. They were able to add expensive equipment to their laboratories. They were able to hire top-notch teachers. But at the same time as doing that, they skewed the whole thing in the direction of pharmaceutical drugs. That was the efficiency in philanthropy. The doctors from that point forward in history would be taught pharmaceutical drugs. All of the great teaching institutions in America were captured by the pharmaceutical interests in this fashion. And it's amazing how little money it really took to do it.
The oligarchy birthed entire medical industries from their own research centers and then sold their own products from their own petrochemical companies as the cure. It was Frank Howard, a Standard Oil of New Jersey executive, who would go on to persuade Alfred Sloan and Charles Kettering to donate their fortunes to the cancer center that would then bear their name. As director of research at Sloan Kettering, Howard appointed Cornelius Rhodes, a Rockefeller Institute pathologist, to develop his wartime research on mustard gas for the U.S. Army into a new cancer therapy. Under Rhodes's leadership, nearly the entire program and staff of the Chemical War Service was reformed into the Sloan Kettering Drug Development Program, where they worked on converting mustard gas into chemotherapy. And once again, the Rockefellers' own snake oil was being sold as a cancer cure-all. The oligarchs' interest in the burgeoning pharmaceutical industry converged in companies like IG Farben, a drug and chemical cartel formed in Germany in the early 20th century. Royal Dutch's own Prince Bernhard served on an IG Farben subsidiary's board in the 1930s, and the cartel's American operation, set up in cooperation with Standard Oil, included on its board Standard Oil president Walter Teagle, as well as Paul Warburg of Kuhn-Loeb and Company, itself headed by Jacob Schiff of the Rothschild broker family. At its height, IG Farben was the largest chemical company in the world, and the 4th largest industrial concern in the world, right behind Standard Oil of New Jersey. The company was broken up after World War II, but like Standard Oil, its various pieces remained intact, and today BASF, one of its chemical offshoots, remains the largest chemical company in the world, while Bayer and Sanofi, 2 of its pharmaceutical offshoots, are among the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Not content merely to monopolize the fields of education and medicine, the same oligarchical interests banded together to take control of America's finances. In 1910, John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s own father-in-law, Senator Nelson Aldrich, Frank Vanderlip of the National City Bank, and Paul Warburg, as well as various agents of J.P. Morgan, met in complete secrecy on Jekyll Island to hammer out the details of what would go on to become the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. The Fed, established in 1913, would be run by hand-picked appointees of the oligarchy and their banking associates, including, perhaps inevitably, Standard Oil president and American IG director Walter Teagle. The Rockefeller family would go on to formally enter the banking field in the 1950s when James Stillman Rockefeller, the grandson of John Dee's brother, was appointed director of National City Bank. Meanwhile, John Dee's own grandson, David Rockefeller, would go on to take over Chase Manhattan Bank, the longtime banking partner of the Standard Oil empire. In this move, the Rockefeller story perfectly mirrored that of their fellow oligarchs, the Rothschilds. Whereas the Rothschilds had supplemented their banking fortune with their oil interests, the Rockefellers supplemented their oil fortune with banking interests. Springboarding from success to success as they consolidated monopolies across every field of human activity, the oligarchs' ambitions became even larger. This time, their goal was to consolidate control over the very food supply of the world itself. And once again, they would use philanthropy as the cover for their business takeover.
The Green Revolution began in 1943 when plant geneticist Norman Borlaug and a team of researchers arrived on Mexican soil. His goal was to improve agricultural techniques and biotechnological methodologies, which in turn would help alleviate starvation and improve the living quality of developing nations. Creating new genetically modified strains of wheat, rice, maize, and other crops, Borlaug planned to win the battle against world hunger. The hope was that these new crops and farming techniques would rescue third world countries from the brink of starvation. That's exactly what happened. The agricultural innovations brought to the poverty-stricken countries gave the farmers the skills and resources necessary to sustain themselves. This triggered a chain of events that would allow these once struggling nations to survive. Agricultural exports soared in quantity and diversity and allowed the countries to become self-sufficient. As the genetically modified crops thrived, farmers were able to use their increased income to purchase newer and superior farming machinery. This increase in revenue made farming easier, more reliable, and more efficient. The Green Revolution led to the modernization of agriculture and has had a profound social, economic, and political impact on the world. The Mexican government turned to the Rockefeller Foundation in their endeavor to nourish Mexico through agriculture.
Norman Borlaug, needless to say, was a researcher for the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Green Revolution, for whatever increase in yields it brought about, also created markets for the oligarchs' own interest in the petrochemical fertilizer industry and gave rise to the ABCD seed cartel of Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. These companies, along with their associated interests in the food packaging and processing industry, formed the core of American agribusiness, a concept developed at Harvard Business School in the 1950s with the help of research conducted by Vasily Leontief for the Rockefeller Foundation. The American agribusiness giants shared a common goal: the transformation of third world agriculture into a captive market for their goods. From this perspective, the project was a runaway success. By the 1970s, the Rockefeller Standard Oil network and its cronies in the nitrogen fertilizer industry, including DuPont, Dow Chemical, and Hercules Powder, had broken into markets around the world, markets conveniently forced open for them by the U.S. government itself under President Johnson's Food for Peace program, which mandated the use of petrochemical-dependent agricultural technologies by aid recipients. Unable to afford these new technologies themselves, the impoverished Third World beneficiaries of this revolution relied on loans from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, handled by Rockefeller's own Chase Manhattan Bank and guaranteed by the U.S. government. The real costs of the Green Revolution, economic, agricultural, and environmental, are seldom tallied. Access to these debt-financed petrochemical-dependent technologies exacerbated the difference between the rich landowning class and the landless peasants in countries like India, where land reform and abolition of usury were dropped from the political agenda after the Green Revolution took over. Even then, the revolution's main success, its increase in agricultural yields, has been oversold. Yield growth across India actually slowed after the introduction of agribusiness. The environmental destruction is even more devastating. An overview in the December 2000 edition of Current Science notes, the Green Revolution has not only increased productivity, but it has also produced several negative ecological consequences, such as depletion of lands, decline in soil fertility, soil salinization, soil erosion, deterioration of environment, health hazards, poor sustainability of agricultural lands, and degradation of biodiversity. Indiscriminate use of pesticides, irrigation, and imbalanced fertilization has threatened sustainability. The Rockefeller Foundation even acknowledges the critiques of the Green Revolution it funded into existence, insisting that current initiatives take into account lessons learned. Even so, the Foundation continues to fund research and write reports on how to improve prospects for agribusiness investment in its target markets. As egregious as the Green Revolution was and continues to be, however, in many ways it was just the prelude to an even more ambitious project, the Gene Revolution. Now the project is not merely to monopolize the technologies, supplies, and chemical inputs for agriculture worldwide, but to monopolize the food supply itself through the replacement of the world's natural seeds with patentable, genetically modified crops. The players involved in this Gene Revolution are almost identical to the players in the Green Revolution, with IG Farben offshoots, Bayer Crop Science and BASF Plant Science, mingling with traditional oligarch associate companies like Dow AgroScience, DuPont Biotechnology, and, of course, Monsanto, all funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and fellow philanthropists at the Ford Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and like-minded organizations. The convergence of corporate, philanthropic, governmental, and intergovernmental interests in promoting GM crops around the world can be seen in the bewildering array of research institutes, industry associations, and consultative groups devoted to the case. The Rockefeller-funded International Rice Research Institute, the Rockefeller-Monsanto USAID Brainchild International Service for the Acquisition of Agribiotech Applications, the Rockefeller-Ford World Bank-created Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research, and dozens of other bland, benign-sounding organizations research and promote GM crops in target markets around the globe, with the profits ending up in the oligarchs' coffers. A representative example of this story is the agribusiness neocolonization of Argentina, where Monsanto ran an elaborate bait-and-switch to get the country hooked on its genetically modified Roundup-ready soybeans, before demanding royalties on the crops that were by then already growing. DuPont then took over, magnanimously beginning a Protein for Life program to foist their own GM soybeans on the country's poor. The same scene has played itself out in country after country, where cartel-developed GM crops are foisted on emerging economies through food aid, usually during times of famine when those countries are especially vulnerable. Only a handful of countries like Zambia or Angola have outright rejected this GMO takeover of their food supply, generously subsidized by the US government to the benefit of the agribusiness cartel. From cutthroat pioneers of the early oil industry to Machiavellian social engineers and geopolitical schemers, the oligarchs have come a long way since the days of Devil Bill's snake oil cure-alls. But his use of every form of deception and trickery to swindle the public informed how John D. and the rest of the oligarchs built up their business interests. As the 20th century drew to a close, it was obvious that for the powerful cartel that built the oil industry, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the British and Dutch royal families, it was no longer about oil, if it ever really was. The takeover of education, of medicine, of the monetary system, of the food supply itself, showed that the aim was much greater than a mere oil monopoly. It was the quest to monopolize all aspects of life, to erect the perfect system of control over every aspect of society, every sector from which any threat of competition to their power could emerge. They had been remarkably, almost unbelievably successful. From oil well to gas pump, farm to fork, hospital to pharmaceutical, drill rig to dollar bill, there was almost no aspect of society that was not under their control. But the oligarchs are not done yet. Their next project, launched in the late 20th century, is almost too ambitious to be comprehended. It is not about oil. It is not about money. It is about the monopolization of life itself. They have spent decades preparing the path for this takeover and marshaled their mind-boggling resources in service of the task. and the vast majority of the world's population, still playing the shell game that the oligarchs perfected and abandoned long ago, are about to fall right into their hands yet again.
Ladies and gentlemen, the battle against climate change is surely the most defining and pivotal challenge of our times. Even in a world full of daunting perils and crises, it is hard to imagine anything that poses a greater challenge and opportunity for humanity.
The negative impact of population growth on all of our planetary ecosystems is becoming appallingly evident.
The science is unequivocally true, and that there is a price to carbon in their future.
What do you see as the biggest challenges in conservation?
The growing human population. Because where we are, there's nothing else.
We have to start spending money, fast on the solutions that we have in hand to try and help these countries which are already seeing the effects of climate change today and seeing the effects of our consumption, basically.
David Rothschild, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg.
Down in Pennsylvania, there is plenty oil, they say. Petroleum, petroleum, we must all have some. The oily fever, don't you see, infects most every live Yankee. From north, from east and west they come for petroleum oil. Oil, 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 oh petroleum. Oil, 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 petroleum.
The Corbett Report is brought to you by the Corbett Report subscriber, a weekly newsletter featuring James Corbett's International Forecaster editorial, recommended reading and viewing, discounts on Corbett Report DVDs, and once a month, a subscriber-only video. Sign up today to start receiving your copy at corbettreport.com/support.
And the paradigm shift to adopt new technologies, new systems, lead the scarcity mindset of total greed and corruption at the expense of common sense and logic. During the future, or bury our heads in the sand. The future of space travel, faster than light abilities through advanced technology that will allow us to harness electromagnetism and understand a unified field kept secret from us since the 40s. We'll either advance into the future boldly, or become victims to our own apathy and ignorance. This system of planned obsolescence must be left behind, a system of efficiency, sustainability, and living in harmony with the environment must be adopted.